What happens when the boy who lived is armed with logic, science, and an insatiable thirst for understanding? Prepare for a tale where reason clashes with magic and the rules of the wizarding world are rewritten. Welcome to Grimoire Audiobooks, your gateway to magical adventures and thought-provoking tales. Today, we continue with Part 6, Chapters 26 to 30 of Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality, an extraordinary fanfiction by the renowned Les Wrong. In this segment, Harry's sharp intellect confronts the mystifying intricacies of wizardry, unraveling mysteries and sparking debates that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about Hogwarts. Disclaimer: this audiobook is a transformative work based on J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter series. All original characters, settings, and trademarks belong to their respective owners. This reading is created purely for entertainment purposes, with no copyright infringement intended. Harry James Potter Evans-Verres continues to shake the foundations of the magical world, wielding logic and reason to dissect its mysteries. As alliances shift and secrets emerge, these chapters dive deeper into the challenges of balancing knowledge with power. As fans eagerly await updates on the upcoming Harry Potter TV adaptation, stories like Methods of Rationality remind us of the infinite ways to reimagine this beloved universe. This fanfiction brings a refreshing perspective that has garnered a cult following for its intellectual depth. Les Wrong, a prominent thinker and writer, is celebrated for their ability to blend philosophy, science, and storytelling. Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality is a testament to their talent, offering a captivating narrative that challenges conventions and inspires critical thinking. So, grab your headphones and immerse yourself in Part 6 of Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality by Les Wrong. Remember, the next part will be released after 50 likes and 50 comments. Your engagement keeps the magic alive. 26. Noticing confusion. Professor Quirrell's office hours consisted of 11:40 to 11:55 a.m. on Thursday. That was for all of his students in all years. It cost a Quirrell point just to knock on the door, and if he didn't think your reason was worth his time, you would lose another 50. Harry knocked on the door. There was a pause. Then a biting voice said, "I suppose you may as well come in, Mr. Potter." And before Harry could touch the doorknob, the door slammed open, hitting the wall with a sharp crack that sounded like something might have broken in the wood, or the stone, or both. Professor Quirrell was leaning back in his chair and reading a suspiciously old-looking book, bound in night blue leather with silver runes on the spine. His eyes had not moved from the pages. "I am not in a good mood, Mr. Potter. And when I am not a good mood, I am not a pleasant person to be around. For your own sake, conduct your business quickly and depart." A cold chill seeped from the room, as though it contained something that cast darkness the way lamps cast light, and which hadn't been fully shaded. Harry was a bit taken aback. Not in a good mood didn't quite seem to cover it. What could be bothering Professor Quirrell this much? Well, you didn't just walk out on friends when they were feeling down. Harry cautiously advanced into the room. "Is there anything I can do to help Dash?" "No," said Professor Quirrell, still not looking up from the book. "I mean, if you've been dealing with idiots and want someone sane to talk to." There was a surprisingly long pause. Professor Quirrell slammed the book shut, and it vanished with a small whispering sound. He looked up, then, and Harry flinched. "I suppose an intelligent conversation would be pleasant for me at this point," said Professor Quirrell in the same biting tone that had invited Harry to enter. "You are not likely to find it so. Be warned." Harry drew a deep breath. "I promise I won't mind if you snap at me." What happened? The cold in the room seemed to deepen. "A sixth-year Gryffindor cast a curse at one of my more promising students, a sixth-year Slytherin." Harry swallowed. What sort of curse? And the fury on Professor Quirrell's face was no longer contained. "Why bother to ask an unimportant question like that, Mr. Potter? Our friend the sixth-year Gryffindor did not think it was important." "Are you serious?" Harry said before he could stop himself. "No, I'm in a terrible mood today for no particular reason. Yes, I'm serious, you fool. He didn't know. He actually didn't know. I didn't believe it until the Aurors confirmed it under Veritasrum. He is in his 6th year at Hogwarts, and he cast a high-level dark curse without knowing what it did. You don't mean, Harry said, that he was mistaken about what it did, that he somehow read the wrong spell description dash. All he knew was that it was meant to be directed at an enemy. He knew that was all he knew, and that had been enough to cast the spell. I do not understand how anything with that small a brain could walk upright. Indeed, Mr. Potter, said Professor Quirrell. There was a pause. Professor Quirrell leaned forward and picked up the silver inkwell from his desk, turning it around in his hands, staring at it as though wondering how he could go about torturing an inkwell to death. Was the 6th year Slytherin seriously hurt? Said Harry. Yes. Was the 6th year Gryffindor raised by Muggles? Yes. Is Dumbledore refusing to expel him because the poor boy didn't know? Professor Quirrell's hands whitened on the inkwell. Do you have a point, Mr. Potter, or are you just stating the obvious? Professor Quirrell, said Harry gravely, all the Muggle-raised students in Hogwarts need a safety lecture in which they are told the things so ridiculously obvious that no wizard-born would ever think to mention them. Don't cast curses if you don't know what they do. If you discover something dangerous, don't tell the world about it. Don't brew high-level potions without supervision in a bathroom. The reason why there are underage magic laws. All the basics. Why? Said Professor Quirrell. Let the stupid ones die before they breed. If you don't mind losing a few 6th year Slytherins along with them. The inkwell caught fire in Professor Quirrell's hands and burned with a terrible slowness, hideous black-orange flames tearing at the metal and seeming to take tiny bites from it, the silver twisting as it melted, as though it were trying and failing to escape. There was a tinny shrieking sound, as though the metal were screaming. I suppose you are right, Professor Quirrell said with a resigned smile. I shall design a lecture to ensure that Muggleborns who are too stupid to live do not take anyone valuable with them as they depart. The inkwell went on screaming and burning in Professor Quirrell's hands, tiny droplets of metal, still on fire, now dripping to the desk, as though the inkwell were crying. You're not running away, observed Professor Quirrell. Harry opened his mouth. If you're about to say you're not scared of me, said Professor Quirrell, don't. You're the scariest person I know, Harry said, and one of the top reasons for that is your control. I simply can't imagine hearing that you'd hurt someone you had not made a deliberate decision to hurt. The fire in Professor Quirrell's hands winked out, and he carefully placed the ruined inkwell on his desk. You say the nicest things, Mr. Potter. Have you been taking lessons in flattery? From, perhaps, Mr. Malfoy? Harry kept his expression blank and realized 1 second too late that it might as well have been a signed confession. Professor Quirrell didn't care what your expression looked like. He cared which states of mind made it likely. I see, said Professor Quirrell. Mr. Malfoy is a useful friend to have, Mr. Potter, and there is much he can teach you. But I hope you have not made the mistake of trusting him with too many confidences. He knows nothing which I fear becoming known, said Harry. Well done, said Professor Quirrell, smiling slightly. So, what was your original business here? I think I'm done with the preliminary exercises in occlumency and ready for the tutor. Professor Quirrell nodded. I shall conduct you to Gringotts this Sunday. He paused, looking at Harry, and smiled. And we might even make it a little outing, if you like. I've just had a pleasant thought. Harry nodded, smiling back. As Harry left the office, he heard Professor Quirrell humming a small tune. Harry was glad he'd been able to cheer him up. That Sunday there seemed to be a rather large number of people whispering in the hallways, at least when Harry Potter walked past them. And a lot of pointed fingers. And a great deal of female giggling. It had started at breakfast, when someone had asked Harry if he'd heard the news, and Harry had quickly interrupted and said that if the news was written by Rita Skeeter, then he didn't want to hear about it. He wanted to read it in the paper himself. It had then developed that not many students at Hogwarts got copies of the Daily Prophet, and that the copies which had not already been bought up from their owners were being passed around in some sort of complicated order, and nobody really knew who had won at the moment. So Harry had used a quieting charm and gone on to eat his breakfast, trusting to his seatmates to wave off the many, many questioners, and doing his best to ignore the incredulity, the laughter, the congratulatory smiles, the pitying looks, the fearful glances, and the dropped plates as new people came down for breakfast and heard. Harry was feeling rather curious, but it really wouldn't have done to spoil the artistry by hearing it secondhand. He'd done homework in the safety of his trunk for the next couple of hours, after telling his dorm mates to come get him if anyone found him an original newspaper. Harry was still ignorant at 10 a.m. when he'd left Hogwarts in a carriage with Professor Quirrell, who was in the front right and currently slumped over in zombie mode. Harry was sitting diagonally across, as far away as the carriage allowed, in the back left. Even so, Harry had a constant feeling of doom as the carriage rattled over a small path through a section of non-forbidden forest. It made it a bit hard to read, especially since the material was difficult, and Harry suddenly wished he was reading one of his childhood science fiction books instead. "We're outside the wards, Mr. Potter," said Professor Quirrell's voice from the front. "Time to go." Professor Quirrell carefully disembarked from the carriage, bracing himself as he stepped down. Harry, on his own side, jumped off. Harry was wondering exactly how they'd get there when Professor Quirrell said catch, and threw a bronze canute at him, and Harry caught it without thinking. A giant, intangible hook caught at Harry's abdomen and yanked him back, hard, only without any sense of acceleration, and an instant later Harry was standing in the middle of Diagon Alley. "Excuse me, what?" said his brain. "We just teleported," explained Harry. "That didn't used to happen in the ancestral environment," Harry's brain complained and disoriented him. Harry staggered as his feet adjusted to the brick of the street instead of the dirt of the forest corridor they had been traversing. He straightened, still dizzy, with the bustling witches and wizards seeming to sway slightly, and the cries of the shopkeepers seeming to move around in his hearing, as his brain tried to place a world to be located in. Moments later, there was a sort of sucking-popping sound from a few paces behind Harry, and when Harry turned to look, Professor Quirrell was there. "Do you mind, Dash?" said Harry, at the same time as Professor Quirrell said, "I'm afraid I dash." Harry stopped. Professor Quirrell didn't. "Need to go off and set something in motion, Mr. Potter. As it has been thoroughly explained to me that I am responsible for anything whatsoever that happens to you, I'll be leaving you with Dash." "Newsstand," Harry said. "Pardon?" "Or anywhere I can buy a copy of the Daily Prophet. Put me there, and I'll be happy." Shortly after, Harry had been delivered into a bookstore, accompanied by several quietly spoken, ambiguous threats. And the shopkeeper had gotten less ambiguous threats, judging by the way he had cringed, and how his eyes now kept darting between Harry and the entrance. If the bookstore burned down, Harry was going to stick around in the middle of the fire until Professor Quirrell got back. Meanwhile, Harry took a quick glance around. The bookstore seemed rather small and shoddy, with only 4 rows of bookcases visible, and the nearest shelf Harry's eyes had jumped to seemed to deal with narrow, cheaply bound books with grim titles like The Massacre of Albania in the 15th century. First things first. Harry stepped over to the seller's counter. "Pardon me," said Harry. "1 copy of the Daily Prophet, please." "5 sickles," said the shopkeeper. "Sorry, kid. I've only got 3 left." 5 sickles dropped onto the counter. Harry had the feeling he could have bargained him down a couple of points, but at this point he didn't really care. The shopkeeper's eyes widened, and he seemed to really notice Harry for the first time. "You? Me? Is it true?" Are you really Dash? Shut up. Sorry, I've been waiting all day to read this in the original newspaper instead of hearing about it secondhand. So please just hand it over, all right? The shopkeeper stared at Harry for a moment, then wordlessly reached under the counter and passed over one folded copy of the Daily Prophet. The headline read, Harry Potter, secretly betrothed to Ginevra Weasley. Harry stared. He lifted the newspaper off the counter, softly, reverently, like he was handling an original Escher artwork, and unbent it to read about the evidence that had convinced Rita Skeeter, and some interesting further details, and yet more evidence. Fred and George had cleared it with their sister first. Surely? Yes, of course they had. There was a picture of Ginevra Weasley sighing longingly over what Harry could see. Looking closely was a photo of himself. That had to have been staged. But how on earth? Harry was sitting in a cheap folding chair, rereading the newspaper for the fourth time, when the door whispered softly and Professor Quirrell came back into the shop. My apologies for... What in Merlin's name are you reading? It would seem, said Harry, awe in his voice, that one Mr. Arthur Weasley was placed under the imperious curse by a Death Eater whom my father killed, thus creating a debt to House Potter, which my father demanded be repaid by the hand in marriage of the recently born Ginevra Weasley. Do people actually do that sort of thing around here? How could Miss Skeeter possibly be fool enough to believe Dash? And Professor Quirrell's voice cut off. Harry had been reading the newspaper held vertically and unfolded, which meant that Professor Quirrell, from where he was standing, could see the text underneath the headline. The look of shock on Professor Quirrell's face was a work of art almost on par with the newspaper itself. Don't worry, said Harry cheerfully. It's all fake. From elsewhere in the store, he heard the shopkeeper gasp. There was the sound of a stack of books falling over. Mr. Potter? Professor Quirrell said slowly. Are you sure of that? Quite sure. Shall we go? Professor Quirrell nodded, looking rather abstracted, and Harry folded the newspaper back up and followed him out of the door. For some reason, Harry didn't seem to be hearing any street noises now. They walked in silence for 30 seconds before Professor Quirrell spoke. Miss Skeeter viewed the original proceedings of the restricted Wisengamot session. Yes. The original proceedings of the Wisengamot. Yes. I would have trouble doing that. Really, said Harry. Because if my suspicions are correct, this was done by a Hogwarts student. That is beyond impossible, Professor Quirrell said flatly. Mr. Potter, I regret to say that this young lady expects to marry you. But that is improbable, said Harry. To quote Douglas Adams, the impossible often has a kind of integrity which the merely improbable lacks. I see your point, Professor Quirrell said slowly. But no, Mr. Potter. It may be impossible, but I can imagine tampering with the Wisengamot proceedings. It is unimaginable that the Grand Manager of Gringotts should affix the seal of his office in witness to a false betrothal contract, and Miss Skeeter personally verified that seal. Indeed, said Harry, you would expect the Grand Manager of Gringotts to get involved with that much money changing hands. It seems Mr. Weasley was greatly in debt, and so demanded an additional payment of 10,000 galleons dash. 10,000 galleons for a Weasley? You could buy the daughter of a noble house for that. Excuse me, Harry said. I really have to ask at this point, do people actually do that sort of thing around here dash? Rarely, said Professor Quirrell, with a frown on his face. And not at all, I suspect, since the Dark Lord departed. I suppose that according to the newspaper, your father just paid it? He didn't have any choice, said Harry. Not if he wanted to fulfill the conditions of the prophecy. Give me that, said Professor Quirrell, and the newspaper leaped out of Harry's hand so fast that he got a paper cut. Harry automatically put the finger in his mouth to suck on, feeling rather shocked, and turned to remonstrate with Professor Quirrell. Professor Quirrell had stopped short in the middle of the street, and his eyes were flickering rapidly back and forth as an invisible force held the newspaper suspended before him. Harry watched, gaping in open awe, as the newspaper opened to reveal pages 2 and 3, and not much long after 4 and 5. It was like the man had cast off a pretense of mortality. And after a troublingly short time, the paper neatly folded itself up again. Professor Quirrell plucked it from the air and tossed it to Harry, who caught it in sheer reflex, and then Professor Quirrell started walking again, and Harry automatically trudged after. "No," said Professor Quirrell, "that prophecy didn't sound quite right to me either." Harry nodded, still stunned. "The centaurs could have been put under an imperious," Professor Quirrell said, frowning. "That seems understandable. What magic can make, magic can corrupt, and it is not unthinkable that the Great Seal of Gringotts could be twisted to another's hand. The unspeakable could have been impersonated with polyjuice, likewise the Bavarian seer. And, with enough effort, it might be possible to tamper with the proceedings of the Wisingamot. Do you have any idea how that was done?" "I do not have one single plausible hypothesis," said Harry. "I do know it was done on a total budget of 40 galleons. Professor Quirrell stopped short and whirled on Harry. His expression was now completely incredulous. 40 galleons will pay a competent wardbreaker to open a path into a home you wish to burglarize. 40,000 galleons might pay a team of the greatest professional criminals in the world to tamper with the proceedings of the Wisingamot." Harry shrugged helplessly. "I'll remember that the next time I want to save 39,960 galleons by finding the right contractor." "I do not say this often," said Professor Quirrell. "I am impressed." "Likewise," said Harry. "And who is this incredible Hogwarts student?" "I'm afraid I couldn't say." Somewhat to Harry's surprise, Professor Quirrell made no objection to this. They walked in the direction of the Gringotts building, thinking, for they were neither of them the sort of person who would give up on the problem without considering it for at least 5 minutes. "I have a feeling," Harry said finally, "that we're coming at this from the wrong angle. There's a tale I once heard about some students who came into a physics class, and the teacher showed them a large metal plate near a fire. She ordered them to feel the metal plate, and they felt that the metal nearer the fire was cooler and the metal further away was warmer. And she said, 'Write down your guess for why this happens.' So some students wrote down because of how the metal conducts heat, and some students wrote down because of how the air moves, and no one said this just seems impossible. And the real answer was that before the students came into the room, the teacher turned the plate around." "Interesting," said Professor Quirrell. "That does sound similar. Is there a moral? That your strength as a rationalist is your ability to be more confused by fiction than by reality," said Harry. "If you're equally good at explaining any outcome, you have zero knowledge." The students thought they could use words like "because of heat conduction" to explain anything, even a metal plate being cooler on the side nearer the fire. So they didn't notice how confused they were, and that meant they couldn't be more confused by falsehood than by truth. "If you tell me that the centaurs were under the imperious curse, I still have the feeling of something being not quite right. I notice that I'm still confused even after hearing your explanation." Said Professor Quirrell. They walked on further. "I don't suppose," said Harry, "that it's possible to actually swap people into alternate universes? Like, this isn't our own Rita Skeeter, or they temporarily sent her somewhere else?" "If that was possible," Professor Quirrell said, his voice rather dry, "would I still be here?" And just as they were almost to the huge white front of the Gringotts building, Professor Quirrell said, "Ah, of course. I see it now. Let me guess, the Weasley twins." "What?" said Harry, his voice going up another octave in pitch. "How?" "I'm afraid I couldn't say. That is not fair." "I think it is extremely fair," said Professor Quirrell, and they entered through the bronze doors. The time was just before noon, and Harry and Professor Quirrell were seated at the foot and head of a wide, long, flat table in a sumptuously appointed private room with thoroughly cushioned couches and chairs along the walls and soft curtains hanging everywhere. They were about to eat lunch in Mary's Place, which Professor Quirrell had said was known to him as one of the best restaurants in Diagon Alley, especially for, his voice had dropped meaningfully, certain purposes. It was the nicest restaurant that Harry had ever been in, and it was really eating away at Harry that Professor Quirrell was treating him to the meal. The first part of the mission, to find an occlumency instructor, had been a success. Professor Quirrell, smiling evilly, had told Griphook to recommend the best he knew and not worry about the expense, since Dumbledore was paying it, and the goblin had smiled in return. There might have been a certain amount of smiling on Harry's part as well. The second part of the plan had been a complete failure. Harry was not allowed to take money out of his vault without Headmaster Dumbledore or some other school official present, and Professor Quirrell had not been given the vault key. Harry's Muggle parents could not authorize it because they were Muggles, and Muggles had around the same legal standing as children or kittens. They were cute, so if you torture them in public you could get arrested, but they weren't people. Some reluctant provision had been made for recognizing the parents of Muggle-borns as human in a limited sense, but Harry's adoptive parents did not fall into that legal category. It seemed that Harry was effectively an orphan in the eyes of the wizarding world. As such, the headmaster of Hogwarts, or his designees within the school system, were Harry's guardians until he graduated. Harry could breathe without Dumbledore's permission, but only so long as the headmaster did not specifically prohibit it. Harry had then asked if he could simply tell Griphook how to diversify his investments beyond stacks of gold coins sitting in his vault. Griphook had stared blankly and asked what diversify meant. Banks, it seemed, did not make investments. Banks stored your gold coins in secure vaults for an annual fee. The wizarding world did not have a concept of stock, or equity, or corporations. Businesses were run by families out of their personal vaults. Loans were made by rich people, not banks. Though Gringotts would witness the contract for a fee and enforce its collection for a much larger fee. Good rich people let their friends borrow money and pay it back whenever. Bad rich people charged you interest. There was no secondary market in loans. Evil rich people charged you annual interest rates of at least 20%. Harry had stood up, turned away, and rested his head against the wall. Harry had asked if he needed the headmaster's permission before he could start a bank. Professor Quirrell had interrupted at this point, saying that it was time for lunch, and swiftly conducted a fuming Harry out of the bronze doors of Gringotts, through Diagon Alley, and to a fine restaurant called Mary's Place, where a room had been reserved for them. The owner had looked shocked at seeing Professor Quirrell accompanied by Harry Potter, but had conducted them to the room without complaint. And Professor Quirrell had quite deliberately announced that he would pay the bill, seeming to rather enjoy the look on Harry's face. "No," said Professor Quirrell to the waitress, "we will not require menus. I will have the daily special accompanied by a bottle of Chianti, and Mr. Potter will have the Duracol soup to start, followed by a plate of Rupo balls and treacle pudding for dessert." The waitress, clad in robes that still looked severe and formal while being rather shorter than usual, bowed respectfully and departed, shutting the door behind her. Professor Quirrell waved a hand in the direction of the door, and a bolt slid shut. Note the bolt on the inside. This room, Mr. Potter, is known as Mary's room. It happens to be proof against all scrying, and I do mean all. Dumbledore himself could detect nothing of what happens here. Mary's room is used by two kinds of people. The first sort are engaged in illicit dalliances, and the second sort lead interesting lives. "Really?" said Harry. Professor Quirrell nodded. Harry's lips were parted in anticipation. It would be a waste to just sit here and eat lunch, then, without doing anything special. Professor Quirrell grinned, then took out his wand and flicked it in the direction of the door. "Of course," he said, "people who lead interesting lives take precautions more thorough than the Dalliers. I have just sealed us in. Nothing will now pass in or out of this room, through the crack under the door, for example." And Professor Quirrell then spoke no fewer than 4 different charms, none of which Harry recognized. "Even that does not really suffice," said Professor Quirrell. "If we were doing anything of truly great import, it would be necessary to perform another 23 checks besides those. If, say, Rita Skeeter knew or guessed that we would come here, it is possible that she could be in this room wearing the true cloak of invisibility. Or she could be an animagus with a tiny form, perhaps. There are tests to rule out such rare possibilities, but to perform all of them would be arduous. Still, I wonder if I should do them anyway, just so as not to teach you bad habits?" And Professor Quirrell tapped a finger on his cheek, looking abstracted. "It's fine," Harry said. "I understand, and I'll remember." Though he was a little disappointed that they weren't doing anything of truly great import. "Very well," Professor Quirrell said. He leaned back in his chair, smiling broadly. "You wrought quite well today, Mr. Potter. The basic notion was yours, I'm sure, even if you delegated the execution. I don't think we'll be hearing much more from Rita Skeeter after this. Lucius Malfoy will not be pleased with her failure. If she's smart, she'll flee the country the instant she realizes she's been fooled." A sinking sensation began to dawn in Harry's stomach. Lucius was behind Rita Skeeter? "Oh, you didn't realize that," said Professor Quirrell. Harry hadn't thought about what would happen to Rita Skeeter afterward. At all. Not in the slightest. But she would get fired from her job. Of course she would be fired. She might have children going through Hogwarts for all Harry knew, and now it was worse. Much worse. Is Lucius going to have her killed? Harry said in a barely audible voice. Somewhere in his head, the Sorting Hat was screaming at him. Professor Quirrell smiled dryly. "If you have not dealt with journalists before, take it from me that the world gets a little brighter every time one dies." Harry jumped out of his chair with a convulsive movement. He had to find Rita Skeeter and warn her before it was too late. "Sit down," Professor Quirrell said sharply. "No, Lucius won't kill her. But Lucius makes life extremely unpleasant for those who serve him ill. Miss Skeeter will flee and start her life over with a new name. Sit down, Mr. Potter. There is nothing you can do at this point, and you have a lesson to learn." Harry sat down slowly. There was a disappointed, annoyed look on Professor Quirrell's face that was doing more to stop him than the words. "There are times," Professor Quirrell said, his voice cutting, "when I worry that your brilliant Slytherin mind is simply wasted on you. Repeat after me. Rita Skeeter was a vile, disgusting woman." "Rita Skeeter was a vile, disgusting woman," Harry said. He wasn't comfortable saying it, but there didn't seem to be any other possible actions, none at all. "Rita Skeeter tried to destroy my reputation, but I executed an ingenious plan and destroyed her reputation first. Rita Skeeter challenged me. She lost the game, and I won. Rita Skeeter was an obstacle to my future plans. I had no choice but to deal with her if I wanted those plans to succeed. Rita Skeeter was my enemy. I cannot possibly get anything done in life if I am not willing to defeat my enemies. I have defeated one of my enemies today. I am a good boy. I deserve a special reward." "Ah," said Professor Quirrell, who had been grinning a benevolent smile for the last few lines. "I see I have succeeded in catching your attention." That was true. And while Harry felt like he was being railroaded into something, no, that wasn't just a feeling. He had been railroaded. He couldn't deny that saying those things and seeing Professor Quirrell smile did make him feel better. Professor Quirrell reached into his robes, the gesture slow and deliberately significant, and drew forth
a book.
It was different from any book Harry had ever seen, the edges and corners visibly misshapen. Rough-hewn was the phrase that came to mind, like it had been hacked out of a book mine. "What is it?" breathed Harry. "A diary," said Professor Quirrell.
"Whose?"
"That of a famous person." Professor Quirrell was smiling broadly. "Okay." Professor Quirrell's expression became more serious. "Mr. Potter, one of the requisites for becoming a powerful wizard is an excellent memory. The key to a puzzle is often something you read 20 years ago in an old scroll, or a peculiar ring you saw on the finger of a man you met only once. I mention this to explain how I managed to remember this item and the placard attached to it, after meeting you a good deal later. You see, Mr. Potter, over the course of my life, I have viewed a number of private collections held by individuals who are, perhaps, not quite deserving of all that they have dashed. You stole it," Harry said incredulously. "That is correct," said Professor Quirrell. "Very recently, in fact. I think you will appreciate this particular item much more than the vile little man who held it for no other purpose than impressing his equally vile friends with its rarity." Harry was simply gaping now. "But if you feel that my actions were incorrect, Mr. Potter, I suppose you needn't accept your special present. Though of course I shan't go to the trouble of stealing it back. So, which is it to be?" Professor Quirrell tossed the book from one hand to another, causing Harry to reach out involuntarily with a look of dismay. "Oh," said Professor Quirrell, "don't worry about a little rough handling. You could toss this diary in a fireplace, and it would emerge unscathed. In any case, I await your decision." Professor Quirrell casually threw the book up into the air and caught it again, grinning. "No," said Gryffindor and Hufflepuff. "Yes," said Ravenclaw. "What part of the words book did you two not understand?" "The theft part," said Hufflepuff. "Oh, come on," said Ravenclaw. "You can't seriously ask us to say no and spend the rest of our life wondering what it was." "It sounds like a net positive from a utilitarian standpoint," said Slytherin. "Think of it as an economic transaction which generates gains from trade, only without the trade part. Plus, we didn't steal it, and it won't help anyone to have Professor Quirrell keep it. He's trying to turn you dark," shrieked Gryffindor, and Hufflepuff nodded firmly. "Don't be a naive little boy," said Slytherin. "He's trying to teach you Slytherin." "Yeah," said Ravenclaw. "Whoever owned the book originally was probably a Death Eater or something. It belongs with us." Harry's mouth opened, then halted that way, an agonized look on his face. Professor Quirrell seemed to be quite enjoying himself. He had balanced the book on its corner on one finger and was keeping it upright while humming a little tune. There came a knock at the door. The book vanished back into Professor Quirrell's robes, and he rose up from his chair. Professor Quirrell started to walk over to the door, and staggered, suddenly lurching into the wall. "It's all right," said Professor Quirrell's voice, which suddenly sounded a lot weaker than usual. "Sit down, Mr. Potter. It's just a dizzy spell. Sit down." Harry's fingers gripped the edge of his chair, uncertain as to what he should do, what he could do. Harry couldn't even get too close to Professor Quirrell, not unless he wanted to defy that sense of doom. Professor Quirrell straightened, then, his breathing seeming a bit heavy, and opened the door. The waitress came in, bearing a platter of food, and as she distributed the plates, Professor Quirrell walked slowly back to the table. But by the time the waitress had bowed her way out, Professor Quirrell was sitting upright and smiling again. Still, the brief episode of whatever it was had decided Harry. He couldn't say no, not after Professor Quirrell had gone to that much trouble. "Yes," Harry said. Professor Quirrell held up a cautioning finger, then took out his wand again, locked the door again, and repeated 3 of the same charms from earlier. Then Professor Quirrell took the book back out of his robes and tossed it to Harry, who almost dropped it into his soup. Harry shot Professor Quirrell a look of helpless indignation. You weren't supposed to do that with books, enchanted or not. Harry opened the book with ingrained, instinctive care. The pages seemed too thick, with a texture unlike either Muggle paper or wizarding parchment. And the contents were blank. Am I supposed to be seeing dash? Look nearer the beginning, said Professor Quirrell, and Harry, again with that helpless, ingrained care, turned a block of pages back. The lettering was obviously handwritten and very hard to read, but Harry thought the words might be Latin. What is this? Said Harry. That, said Professor Quirrell, is a record of the magical researches of a Muggle-born who never came to Hogwarts. He refused his letter and conducted his own small investigations, which never did get very far without a wand. From the description on the placard, I expect that his name bears rather more significance to you than to me. That Harry Potter is the diary of Roger Bacon. Harry almost fainted. Nestled up against the wall, where Professor Quirrell had stumbled, glistened the crushed remains of a beautiful blue beetle. 27. Empathy. It wasn't every day you got to see Harry Potter beg. Please, whined Harry Potter. Fred and George shook their heads again, smiling. There was an agonized look on Harry Potter's face. But I told you how I did the one with Kevin Entwistle's cat and Hermione and the vanishing soda, and I can't tell you about the sorting hat or the Remembrall or Professor Snape. Fred and George shrugged and turned to leave. If you ever do figure it out, said the Weasley twins, be sure to let us know. You're evil. You're both evil. Fred and George firmly closed the door to the empty classroom behind them and made sure to keep the grin on their faces for a while, just in case Harry Potter could see through doors. Then they turned a corner, and their faces sagged. I don't suppose Harry's guess is dash. Gave you any ideas? They said to each other at the same time, and then their shoulders slumped further. Their last relevant memory was of Flume refusing to help them, though they couldn't remember what they'd asked him to do. But they must have looked elsewhere and found someone to help them do something illegal, or they wouldn't have agreed to be obliviated afterward. How had they possibly been able to get all that done on just 40 galleons? At first they'd worried that they'd forged evidence so good that Harry actually would end up married to Ginny, but they'd thought of that too, it seemed. The Wisengamot proceedings had been tampered with again to put them back the way they'd been originally. The fake betrothal contract had vanished from its dragon-guarded vault in Gringotts, and so on. It was pretty scary, actually. Most people now thought the Daily Prophet had just made the whole thing up for unguessable reasons, and the Quibbler had helpfully twisted the knife deeper with the next day's headline, Harry Potter secretly betrothed, Luna Lovegood. Whoever they'd hired would tell them after the statute of limitations expired. They desperately hoped. But meanwhile it was awful. They'd pulled their greatest prank ever. Maybe the greatest prank in the history of pranking, and they couldn't remember how. It was crazy. They'd been able to think of a way the first time. So why couldn't they see it now after knowing everything they'd done? Their only consolation was that Harry didn't know they didn't know. Not even Mum had questioned them about it, despite the obvious Weasley connection. Whatever had been done, it was far out of the reach of any Hogwarts student, except possibly one, who, if certain rumors were true, might have done it by snapping his fingers. Harry had been questioned under Veritasrum. He'd told them, with Dumbledore present and giving the Aurors scary looks. The Aurors had asked just enough to determine that Harry hadn't pulled the prank himself or disappeared anyone, and then gotten the heck out of Hogwarts. Fred and George had wondered whether to feel insulted about Harry Potter being questioned by the Aurors for their prank, but the look on Harry's face, probably for exactly the same reason, made everything worth it. Unsurprisingly, Rita Skeeter and the editor of the Daily Prophet had both vanished, and were probably in another country by now. They would have liked to be able to tell their family about that part. Dad would have congratulated them, they thought, after Mum had finished killing them and Ginny had burned the remains. But everything was still all right, they'd tell Dad someday, and meanwhile, Meanwhile, Dumbledore had happened to sneeze while passing them the hallway, and a small package had accidentally dropped out of his pockets, and inside had been two matched Wardbreaker's monocles of incredible quality. The Weasley twins had tested their new monocles on the forbidden third-floor corridor, making a quick trip to the magic mirror and back, and they hadn't been able to see all the detection webs clearly, but the monocles had shown a lot more than they'd seen the first time. Of course, they would have to be very careful never to get caught with the monocles in their possession, or they would end up in the headmaster's office getting a stern lecture and maybe even threats of expulsion. It was good to know that not everyone who got sorted into Gryffindor grew up to be Professor McGonagall. Harry was in a white room, windowless, featureless, sitting before a desk, facing an expressionless man in formal robes of solid black. The room was screened against detection, and the man had performed exactly 27 spells before saying so much as hello, Mr. Potter. It was oddly appropriate that the man in black was about to try reading Harry's mind. "Prepare yourself," the man said tonelessly. A human mind, Harry's occlumency book had said, was only exposed to a legilimens along certain surfaces. If you failed to defend your surfaces, the legilimens would go through and be able to access any part of you which their own mind was able to comprehend, which tended not to be much. Human minds, it seemed, were hard for humans to understand on any level but the shallowest. Harry had wondered if knowing lots of cognitive science could make him an incredibly powerful legilimens, but repeated experience had finally driven into him the lesson that he needed to get a little less excited in his anticipations about this sort of thing. It wasn't as if any cognitive scientist understood humans well enough to make one. To learn the counter, occlumency, the first step was to imagine yourself to be a different person, pretending it as thoroughly as you could, immersing yourself entirely in that alternate persona. You wouldn't always have to do that, but in the beginning, it was how you learned where your surfaces were. The legilimens would try to read you, and you would feel it happening if you paid close enough attention. You would sense them trying to enter. And your job was to make sure that they always touched your imaginary persona, and not the real one. When you were good enough at that, you could imagine being a very simple sort of person, pretend to be a rock, and make a habit of leaving the pretense in place where all your surfaces were. That was a standard occlumency barrier. Pretending to be a rock was hard to learn, but easy to do afterward, and the exposed surface of a mind was much shallower than its interior, so with enough practice you could keep it up as a background habit. Or, if you were a perfect occlumens, you could race ahead of any probes, answering queries as fast as they were asked, so that the legilimens would enter through your surfaces and see a mind indistinguishable from whoever you were pretending to be. Even the best legilimens could be fooled that way. If a perfect occlumens claimed they were dropping their occlumency barriers, there was no way to know if they were lying. Worse, you might not know you were dealing with a perfect occlumens. They were rare, but the fact that they existed meant you couldn't trust legilimency on anyone. It was a sad commentary on how little human beings understood each other, how little any wizard comprehended the depths lying beneath the mind's surface, that you could fool the best human telepaths by pretending to be someone else. But then human beings only understood each other in the first place by pretending. You didn't make predictions about people by modeling the 100 trillion synapses in their brain as separate objects. Ask the best social manipulator on Earth to build you an artificial intelligence from scratch, and they'd just give you a dumb look. You predicted people by telling your brain to act like theirs. You put yourself in their place. If you wanted to know what an angry person would do, you activated your own brain's anger circuitry, and whatever that circuitry output, that was your prediction. What did the neural circuitry for anger actually look like inside? Who knew? The best social manipulator on Earth might not know what neurons were, and neither might the best legilimens. Anything a legilimens could understand, an occlumens could pretend to be. It was the same trick either way, probably implemented by the same neural circuitry in both cases, a single set of control circuits for reconfiguring your own brain to act as a model of someone else's. And so the race between telepathic offense and telepathic defense had been a decisive win for defense. Otherwise, the entire magical world, maybe even the whole Earth, would have been a very different place. Harry took a deep breath and concentrated. There was a slight smile on his face. For once, just once, Harry hadn't gotten shortchanged in the mysterious powers department. After almost a month of work, and more on a whim than any real hunch, Harry had decided to make himself coldly angry and then try the book's occlumency exercises again. At that point, he'd mostly given up hope on that sort of thing, but it had still seemed worth a quick try. He'd run through all the book's hardest exercises in 2 hours, and the next day he'd gone and told Professor Quirrell he was ready. His dark side, it had turned out, was very, very good at pretending to be other people. Harry thought of his standard trigger from the first time he'd gone over entirely to his dark side. Severus paused, looking quite pleased with himself. And that will be 5 points? No, let us make it an even 10 points from Ravenclaw for backchat. Harry's smile grew chillier, and he regarded the black-robed man who thought he was going to read Harry's mind. And then Harry turned into someone else entirely, someone who had seemed appropriate to the occasion. In a white room, windowless, featureless, sitting before a desk, facing an expressionless man in formal robes of solid black. Kimble Kinnison regarded the black-robed man who thought he was going to read the mind of a second-stage lensman of the Galactic Patrol. To say that Kimble Kinnison was confident of the outcome would be an understatement. He had been trained by Mentor of Arisia, the most powerful mind known to this or any other universe, and the mere wizard sitting across from him would see precisely what the Grey Lensman wanted him to see. The mind of the boy he was currently disguised as, an innocent child named Harry Potter. "I'm ready," said Kimble Kinnison in nervous tones that were exactly appropriate for an 11-year-old boy. "Legilimens," said the black-robed wizard. There was a pause. The black-robed wizard blinked, as if he'd seen something so shocking that it had been enough to make even his eyelids move. His voice wasn't quite toneless as he said, "The boy who lived has a mysterious dark side." The heat slowly crept up into Harry's cheeks. "Well," the man said. His face had now settled back into perfect calm. "Excuse me, Mr. Potter, it is good to know your advantages, but that is not the same as being wildly overconfident in them. You may indeed be able to learn occlumency at 11 years of age." "This astounds me. I had thought Mr. Dumbledore was pretending to be insane again. Your dissociative talent is so strong that I am surprised to find no other signs of childhood abuse, and you may become a perfect occlumens in time. But there is a considerable difference between that and expecting to put up a successful occlumency barrier on your first attempt. That is merely ridiculous. Did you feel anything as I read your mind?" Harry shook his head, now blushing furiously. "Then pay closer attention next time. The goal is not to create a perfect image on your first day of lessons. The goal is to learn where your surfaces are. Prepare yourself." Harry tried to pretend to be Kimble Kinnison again, tried to pay more attention, but his thoughts were a little scattered, and he was suddenly aware of all the things he shouldn't be thinking about. Oh, this is going to suck. Harry gritted his teeth. At least the instructor would be obliviated afterward. Legilimens. There was a pause. In a white room, windowless, featureless, sitting before a desk, facing an expressionless man in formal robes of solid black. It was their 4th day on a Sunday evening. When you paid this much, you got your sessions any darn time you wanted, never mind the concept of weekends. "Hello, Mr. Potter," the telepath said tonelessly, having cast the full suite of privacy spells. "Hello, Mr. Bester," Harry said wearily. "Let's just get the initial shock out of the way, shall we?" "You managed to surprise me," the man said, now sounding slightly interested. "Well then." He pointed his wand and stared into Harry's eyes. "Legilimens." There was a pause, and then the black-robed wizard jerked as if someone had touched him with a cattle prod. "The Dark Lord is alive," he choked. His eyes were suddenly wild. Dumbledore turns himself invisible and sneaks into girls' dorm rooms. Harry sighed and looked down at his watch. In about another 3 seconds, "So," the man said. He hadn't quite recovered his tonelessness. "You genuinely believe you're going to discover the secret rules of magic and become all-powerful?" "That's right," Harry said evenly, still looking at his watch. "I'm that overconfident. I wonder. It seems the Sorting Hat thinks you'll be the next Dark Lord. And, I'm trying pretty hard not to be, and you saw that we already had a long discussion about whether you were willing to teach me occlumency, and in the end you decided to do it, so can we just get this over with?" "All right," said the man exactly 6 seconds later, same as last time. "Prepare yourself." He paused, and then said, his voice rather wistful, "Though I do wish I could remember that trick with the gold and silver." Harry was finding himself very disturbed by how reproducible human thoughts were when you reset people back to the same initial conditions and expose them to the same stimuli. It was dispelling illusions that a good reductionist wasn't supposed to have in the first place. Harry was in a rather bad mood as he stomped out of his herbology class the next Monday morning. Hermione was seething alongside him. The other children were still inside, a bit slow to assemble their things because they were gibbering excitedly to each other about Ravenclaw winning the year's second Quidditch match. It seemed that last night after dinner, a girl had flown around on a broomstick for 30 minutes and then caught some sort of giant mosquito. There were other facts about what had happened during this match, but they were irrelevant. Harry had missed this exciting sports event due to his occlumency lesson and also having a life. He had then avoided all conversations in the Ravenclaw dorm. Weren't quieting charms and magical trunks wonderful? He had eaten breakfast at the Gryffindor table. But Harry couldn't avoid herbology, and the Ravenclaws had talked about it before class, and after class, and during class, until Harry had looked up from the baby fur cot whose diaper he was changing, and announced loudly that some of them were trying to learn about plants and snitches didn't grow on anything, so could they all please shut up about Quidditch. Everyone else present had given him shocked looks, except Hermione, who looked like she wanted to applaud, and Professor Sprout, who had awarded him a point for Ravenclaw. A point for Ravenclaw. 1 point. The 7 idiots on their idiot brooms playing their idiot game had earned 190 points for Ravenclaw. It seemed that Quidditch scores added directly onto the house points total. In other words, catching a golden mosquito was worth 150 house points. Harry couldn't even imagine what he would have to do to earn 150 house points. Besides, rescuing 150 Hufflepuffs, or coming up with 15 ideas as good as putting protective shells on time machines, or inventing 1,500 creative ways to kill people, or being Hermione Granger for the entire year. "We should kill them," Harry said to Hermione, who was walking beside him with an equally offended air. "Who?" said Hermione. "The Quidditch team?" "I was thinking of everyone involved in any way with Quidditch anywhere, but the Ravenclaw team would be a start, yes." Hermione's lips were pursed disapprovingly. "You do know that killing people is wrong, Harry?" "Yes," Harry said. "Okay, just checking," Hermione said. "Let's get the Seeker first. I've read some Agatha Christie mysteries. Do you know how we can get her onto a train?" "2 students plotting murder," said a dry voice. "How shocking." From around a nearby corner strolled a man in lightly spotted robes, his greasy hair falling long and unkempt about his shoulders. Deadly danger seemed to radiate out from him, filling the hallway with improperly mixed potions and accidental falls and people dying in bed of what the Aurors would rule to be natural causes. Without thinking about it at all, Harry stepped in front of Hermione. There was an intake of breath from behind him, and then a moment later Hermione brushed past and stepped in front of him. "Run, Harry," she said. "Boys shouldn't have to be in danger." Severus Snape smiled mirthlessly. Amusing. I request a moment of your time, Potter, if you can tear yourself away from your flirtations with Miss Granger. Suddenly, there was a very worried look on Hermione's face. She turned to Harry and opened her mouth, then paused, looking distressed. "Oh, don't worry, Miss Granger," said Severus's silky voice. "I promise to return your bow unmaimed." His smile vanished. "Now Potter and I are about to go off and have a private conversation, just by ourselves. I hope it is clear that you are not invited, but just in case, consider that an order from a Hogwarts professor. I'm sure a good little girl like you won't disobey." And Severus turned and walked back around the corner. "Coming, Potter," his voice said. Harry said to Hermione, "Can I just sort of go off and follow him and let you work out what I should say to make sure you're not all worried and offended?" "No," Hermione said, her voice trembling. Severus's laughter echoed from around the corner. Harry bowed his head. "Sorry," he said lowly, "really," and he went off after the potion's master. "So," Harry said. There were no other sounds now but 2 pairs of legs, the long and the short, padding across a random stone corridor. The potion's master was striding quickly but not too fast for Harry to keep up, and insofar as Harry could apply the concept of directionality to Hogwarts, they were moving away from the frequented areas. "What's this about?" "I don't suppose you could explain," Severus said dryly. "Why the 2 of you were plotting to murder Cho Chang?" "I don't suppose you could explain," Harry said dryly, "in your capacity as an official of the Hogwarts school system, why catching a golden mosquito is deemed an academic accomplishment worthy of 150 house points." A smile crossed Severus's lips. "Dear me, and I thought you were supposed to be perceptive. Are you truly so incapable of understanding your classmates, Potter? Or do you dislike them too much to try? If Quidditch scores did not count toward the House Cup, then none of them would care about house points at all. It would merely be an obscure contest for students like you and Miss Granger." It was a shockingly good answer, and that shock brought Harry's mind fully awake. In retrospect, it shouldn't have been surprising that Severus understood his students, understood them very well indeed. He had been reading their minds, and the book said that a successful legilimens was extremely rare, rarer than a perfect eclimens, because almost no one had enough mental discipline. Mental discipline? Harry had collected stories about a man who routinely lost his temper in class and blew up at young children. But this same man, when Harry had spoken of the Dark Lord still being alive, had responded instantly and perfectly, reacting in precisely the way that someone completely ignorant would react. The man stalked about Hogwarts with the air of an assassin, radiating danger, which was exactly not what a real assassin should do. Real assassins should look like meek little accountants until they killed you. He was the head of house for proud and aristocratic Slytherin, and he wore a robe with spotted stains from bits of potions and ingredients, which 2 minutes of magic could have removed. Harry noticed that he was confused, and his threat estimate of the head of House Slytherin shot up astronomically. Dumbledore had seemed to think Severus was his, and there'd been nothing to contradict that. The potion's master had been scary but not abusive as promised. So, Harry had reasoned earlier, this was fellowship business. If Severus had been planning harm, surely he wouldn't have come to get Harry in front of Hermione, a witness, when he could have simply waited for some time when Harry was alone. Harry quietly bit his lip. "I once knew a boy who truly adored Quidditch," said Severus Snape. "He was an utter pillock, just as you and I would expect. We too." "What is this?" Harry said slowly. "Patience, Potter." Severus turned his head, and then glided with his assassins bearing into a nearby opening in the corridor walls, a smaller and narrower hallway leading off. Harry followed him, wondering if it would be smarter to simply run away. They turned and made another turn and came to a dead end, a simple blank wall. If Hogwarts had actually been built, rather than conjured or summoned or birthed or whatever, Harry would have had some sharp words for the architect about paying people to build hallways that didn't go anywhere. Quietus, said Severus, and a few other things as well. Harry leaned back, folded his arms across his chest, and watched Severus's face. Looking me in the eyes, Potter, said Severus Snape. Your clemency lessons cannot have progressed far enough for you to block legilimency. But then perhaps they have progressed far enough for you to detect it. Since I cannot know otherwise, I will not risk trying. The man smiled thinly. And the same will hold for Dumbledore, I think. Which is why we are now having this little talk. Harry's eyes widened involuntarily. To begin with, Severus said, eyes glittering, I should like you to promise not to speak of our conversations to anyone. So far as the school is concerned, we are discussing your potions homework. Whether or not they believe that is unimportant. So far as Dumbledore and McGonagall are concerned, I am violating Draco Malfoy's confidences in me, and neither of us think it proper to speak further of the particulars. Harry's brain tried to calculate the ramifications and implications of this, and ran out of swap space. Well, said the potions master. All right, Harry said slowly. It was hard to see how having a conversation and being unable to tell anyone could be more constraining than not having it, in which case you also couldn't tell anyone the contents. I promise. Severus was watching Harry intently. You said once in the headmaster's office that you would not tolerate bullying or abuse. And so I wonder, Harry Potter, just how much do you resemble your father? Unless we're talking about Michael Evans, Harry said, the answer is that I know very little about James Potter. Severus nodded, as though to himself. There is a fifth-year Slytherin, a boy named Lesseth Lestrange. He is being bullied by Gryffindors. I am constrained in my ability to deal with such situations. You could help him, perhaps, if you wished. I am not asking you for a favor, and will not owe you one. It is simply an opportunity to do as you will. Harry stared at Severus, thinking. Wondering if it's a trap, said Severus, a faint smile crossing his lips. It is not. It is a test. Call it curiosity on my part. But Lesseth's troubles are real, as are my own difficulties in intervening. That was the trouble with other people knowing you were a good guy. Even if you knew they knew, you still couldn't ignore the bait. And if his father had protected students from bullies too, it didn't matter if Harry knew why Severus had told him. It still made him feel warm inside and proud, and made it impossible to walk away. Fine, Harry said. Tell me about Lesseth. Why is he being bullied? Severus's face lost the faint smile. You think there are reasons, Potter? Perhaps not, Harry said quietly. But the thought had occurred to me that he might have pushed some unimportant mudblood girl down the stairs. Lesseth Lestrange, Severus said, his voice now cold, is the son of Bellatrix Black, the most fanatic and evil servant of the Dark Lord. Lesseth is the acknowledged bastard of Rabaston Lestrange. Shortly after the Dark Lord's death, Bellatrix and Rabaston's brother Rodolphus were captured while torturing Alice and Frank Longbottom. All three are in Azkaban for life. The Longbottoms were driven insane by repeated cruciatus and remain in St. Mungo's incurable ward. Is any of that a good reason to bully him, Potter? It is no reason at all, Harry said, still quietly. And Lesseth himself has done no wrong that you know. The faint smile crossed Severus's lips again. He is no more a saint than anyone else. But he has pushed no mudblood girls down the stairs, not that I ever heard. Or saw in his mind, said Harry. Severus's expression was chill. I did not invade his privacy, Potter. I looked within the Gryffindors, rather. He is simply a convenient target for their little satisfactions. A cold wash of anger ran down Harry's spine, and he had to remind himself that Severus might not be a trustworthy source of information. "And you think," Harry said, "that an intervention by Harry Potter, the boy who lived, might prove effective?" "Indeed," said Severus Snape, and told Harry when and where the Gryffindors were planning their next little game. There is a main hallway running through the middle of Hogwarts' second floor on the north-south axis, and near the center of this hallway there is an opening into a short corridor which goes a dozen paces back before turning at a right angle, making an L shape, and then goes a dozen paces more before it ends at a bright, wide window, looking out from 3 stories above upon the light drizzle falling over the east grounds of Hogwarts. Standing by the window, you can hear nothing of the main hallway, and no one in the hallway would hear what went on by the window. If you think there is anything odd about this, you haven't been in Hogwarts very long. For boys in red-trimmed robes are laughing, and a boy in green-trimmed robes is screaming and grabbing frantically onto the edges of the open window with his hands, as the 4 boys make as though to push him out. It's just a joke, of course, and besides, a fall from that height wouldn't kill a wizard. All good fun. If you think there is anything odd about this. "What are you doing?" says a 6th boy's voice. The 4 boys in red-trimmed robes spin around with sudden starts, and the boy in green-trimmed robes frantically pushes himself away from the window and falls to the floor, face streaked with tears. "Oh," says the most handsome of the boys in red-trimmed robes, sounding relieved. "It's you." "Hey, Leslie, you know who this is?" There isn't any answer from the boy on the floor, who's trying to get his sniffling under control, and the boy in the red-trimmed robes draws back his leg for a kick. "Stop it," shouts the 6th boy. The boy in the red-trimmed robes wobbles as he aborts the kick. He says, "Do you know who this is?" The 6th boy's breathing sounds strange. "Lesseth Lestrange," he says, his breath coming in short pants. "And he didn't do anything to my parents. He was 5 years old." Neville Longbottom stared at the 4 huge 5th-year bullies in front of him, trying very hard to control his trembling. He should have just told Harry Potter no. "Why are you defending him?" said the handsome one, slowly, sounding puzzled with the first hints of offense. "He's a Slytherin. And a Lestrange. He's a boy who lost his parents," said Neville Longbottom. "I know how that is." He didn't know where the words had come from. It sounded too cool, like something Harry Potter would say. The trembling went on, though. "Who do you think you are?" said the handsome one, starting to sound angry. "I am Neville, the last scion of the noble and most ancient house of Longbottom." Neville couldn't say it. "I think he's a traitor," said one of the other Gryffindors, and there was a sudden sinking sensation in Neville's stomach. He'd known it, he'd just known it. Harry Potter had been wrong after all. Bullies wouldn't stop only because Neville Longbottom told them to stop. The handsome one took a step forward, and the 3 others followed. "So that's how it is for you," Neville said, amazed at how steady his voice was. "It doesn't matter to you if it's Lesseth Lestrange or Neville Longbottom." Lesseth Lestrange let out a sudden gasp from where he was lying on the floor. "Evil is evil," snarled the same boy who'd spoken before, "and if you're friends with evil, you're evil too." The 4 took another step forward. Lesseth rose, wobbling, to his feet. His face was gray, and he took a few steps forward and leaned against the wall and didn't say anything. His eyes were fixed on the turn in the hallway, the way out. "Friends," Neville said. Now his voice was going up a bit in pitch. "Yes, I have friends. One of them is the boy who lived." A couple of the Gryffindors looked suddenly worried. The handsome one didn't flinch. "Harry Potter isn't here," he said, his voice hard. "And if he was, I don't think he'd like to see a Longbottom defending a Lestrange." And the Gryffindors took another long step forward, and behind them, Lesseth crept along the wall, waiting for his chance. Neville swallowed and raised his right hand with his thumb and forefinger pressed together. He shut his eyes because Harry Potter had made him promise not to peek. If this didn't work, he was never trusting anyone again. His voice came out surprisingly clear, considering. Harry James Potter Evans Bears. Harry James Potter Evans Bears. Harry James Potter Evans Bears. By the debt that you owe me and the power of your true name I summon you. I open the way for you. I call upon you to manifest yourself before me. Neville snapped his fingers. And then Neville opened his eyes. Lesseth Lestrange was staring at him. The 4 Gryffindors were staring at him. The handsome one started to chuckle, and that set off the other 3. Was Harry Potter supposed to step around the corner or something? Said the handsome one. Ah, looks like you've been stood up. The handsome one took a menacing step forward toward Neville. The other 3 followed in lockstep. Ahem, said Harry Potter from behind them, leaning against the wall by the window, in the dead end of the hallway, where nobody could possibly have gotten to without being seen. If watching people scream always felt this good, Neville could sort of understand why people became bullies. Harry Potter stalked forward, placing himself between Lesseth Lestrange and the others. He swept his icy gaze across the boys in red-trimmed robes, and then his eyes came to rest on the handsome one, the ringleader. Mr. Carl Sloper, said Harry Potter. I believe I have comprehended this situation fully. If Lesseth Lestrange has ever committed a single evil himself, rather than being born to the wrong parents, the fact is not known to you. If I am mistaken in this, Mr. Sloper, I suggest you inform me at once. Neville saw the fear and awe on the other boys' faces. He was feeling it himself. Harry had claimed it would all be a trick, but how could it be? But he's a Lestrange, said the ringleader. He's a boy who lost his parents, Harry Potter said, his voice growing even colder. This time, all 3 of the other Gryffindors flinched. So, said Harry Potter, you saw that Neville didn't want you tormenting an innocent boy on behalf of the Longbottoms. This failed to move you. If I tell you that the boy who lived also thinks you are in the wrong, that what you did today was a terrible mistake, does that make a difference? The ringleader took a step toward Harry. The others did not follow him. Carl, one of them said, swallowing. Maybe we should go. They say you're going to be the next Dark Lord, the ringleader said, staring at Harry. A grin crossed Harry Potter's face. They also say I'm secretly betrothed to Ginevra Weasley, and there's a prophecy about us conquering France. The smile faded. Since you're determined to force the issue, Mr. Carl Sloper, let me make things clear. Leave Lesseth alone. I will know if you don't. So Lessie snarked to you, said the ringleader coldly. Sure, said Harry Potter dryly, and he also told me what you did today after you left Charms class, in a private secluded place where no one could see you, with a certain Hufflepuff girl wearing a white ribbon in her hair dash. The ringleader's jaw dropped in shock. Eep, said one of the other Gryffindors in a high-pitched voice, and spun on his heels and ran around the corner. His footsteps rapidly pattered away and faded. And then there were 6. Ah, said Harry Potter, there goes a slightly intelligent young man. The rest of you could stand to learn from Bertram Kirk's example, before you get into, shall we say, trouble. Are you threatening to snark on us? Said the handsome Gryffindor, his voice trying to be angry and rather wavering. Bad things happen to snarkers. The other 2 Gryffindors started slowly moving back. Harry Potter started laughing. Oh, you did not just say that. Are you really trying to intimidate me? Me? Now, honestly, do you think you're scarier than Peregrine Derek, Severus Snape, or for that matter, you know who? Even the ringleader flinched at that. Harry Potter raised his hand, fingers poised, and all 3 of the Gryffindors leaped backward, and one of them blurted, "Don't." "See," said Harry Potter, "this is where I snap my fingers and you become part of a hilariously amusing story that will be told with much nervous laughter at dinner tonight. But the thing is, people I trust keep telling me not to do that." Professor McGonagall told me I was taking the easy way out of everything, and Professor Quirrell says I need to learn how to lose. So you remember that story where I let myself get beaten up by some older Slytherins? We could do that. You could bully me for a while, and I could let you. Only you remember that part at the end where I tell my many, many friends inside the school not to do anything about it? This time we'll skip that part. So go ahead. Bully me. Harry Potter stepped forward, his arms opened wide in invitation. The three Gryffindors broke and ran, and Neville had to sidestep quickly to avoid getting run over. There was silence as their footsteps faded, and then more silence after that. And then there were three. Harry Potter drew a deep breath, then exhaled. "Phew," he said. "How are you doing, Neville?" Neville's voice came out in a high-pitched squeak. "Okay, that was really cool." A grin flashed across Harry Potter's face. "You were pretty cool too, you know." Neville knew that Harry Potter was just saying that, trying to make him feel good, and it still started a warm glow inside his chest. Harry turned toward Lesseth Lestrange. "Are you okay, Lestrange?" said Neville before Harry could open his mouth. Now, there was something you didn't expect to find yourself saying, ever. Lesseth Lestrange turned slowly and stared at Neville, his face tight, no longer crying, tears glistening as they dried. "You think you know how it is?" said Lesseth, his voice high and shaking. "You think you know? My parents are in Azkaban. I try not to think about it, and they always remind me. They think it's great that Mother is there in the cold and the dark with the Dementus sucking away her life. I wish I was like Harry Potter. At least his parents aren't hurting. My parents are always hurting. Every second of every day. I wish I was like you. At least you can see your parents sometimes. At least you know they loved you. If Mother ever loved me, the Dementus will have eaten that thought by now, Dash." Neville's eyes were wide with shock. He hadn't expected this. Lesseth turned to Harry Potter, whose eyes were full of horror. Lesseth flung himself on the floor in front of Harry Potter, touched his forehead to the ground, and whispered, "Help me, Lord." There was an awful silence. Neville couldn't think of a single thing to say, and from the naked shock on Harry's face, he couldn't think of anything either. "They say you can do anything. Please, please, my lord, get my parents out of Azkaban. I'll be your loyal servant forever. My life will be yours and my death as well. Only please, Dash." "Lesseth," Harry said, his voice breaking. "Lesseth, I can't really do things like that. It's all just stupid tricks." "It's not," said Lesseth, his voice high and desperate. "I saw it. The stories are true. You can." Harry swallowed. "Lesseth, I set the whole thing up with Neville. We planned it all out in advance. Ask him." They had, though Harry hadn't said how he was going to do any of it. When Lesseth looked up from the floor, his face was ghastly, and his voice came out in a shriek that hurt Neville's ears. "You son of a mudblood. You could get her out. You just won't. I got down on my knees and begged you, and you still won't help. I should have known. You're the boy who lived. You think she belongs there." "I can't," Harry said, his voice as desperate as Lesseth's. "It's not a question of what I want. I don't have the power." Lesseth rose to his feet and spat on the floor in front of Harry, and then turned and walked away. When he was around the corner, the sound of his feet sped up, and as they faded, Neville thought he heard a single sob. And then there were two. Neville looked at Harry. Harry looked at Neville. "Wow," Neville said quietly. He didn't seem very grateful for being rescued. "He thought I could help him," Harry said, his voice hoarse. He had hope for the first time in years. Neville swallowed and said it. "I'm sorry." "Wah," said Harry, sounding totally confused. "I wasn't grateful when you helped me, Dash. Every single thing you said before was completely right," said the boy who lived. "No," Neville said, "it wasn't." They simultaneously gave brief, sad smiles, each condescending to the other. I know this wasn't real, said Neville. I know I couldn't have done anything if you hadn't been here, but thanks for letting me pretend. Give me a break, said Harry. Harry had turned from Neville and was staring out the window at the gloomy clouds. A completely ridiculous thought came to Neville. Are you feeling guilty because you can't get Lessith's parents out of Azkaban?
No, said Harry.
A few seconds went by. Yes, said Harry. You're silly, said Neville. I am aware of this, said Harry. Do you have to do literally anything anyone asks you? The boy who lived turned back and looked at Neville again. Do?
No.
Feel guilty about not doing? Yes. Neville was having trouble finding words. Once the Dark Lord died, Bellatrix Black was literally the most evil person in the entire world, and that was before she went to Azkaban. She tortured my mother and father into insanity because she wanted to find out what happened to the Dark Lord Dash. I know, Harry said quietly. I get that, but Dash...
No.
You don't. She had a reason for doing that, and my parents were both Aurors. It's not even close to the worst thing she's ever done. Neville's voice was shaking. Even so, said the boy who lived, his eyes distant as they stared off into somewhere else, some other place that Neville couldn't imagine. There might be some incredibly clever solution that makes it possible to save everyone and let them all live happily ever after. And if only I was smart enough, I would have thought of it by now, Dash. You have problems, said Neville. You think you ought to be what Lessith Lestrange thinks you are? Yeah, said the boy who lived. That pretty much nails it. Every time someone cries out in prayer, and I can't answer, I feel guilty about not being God. Neville didn't quite understand that, but that doesn't sound good.
Harry sighed.
I understand that I have a problem, and I know what I need to do to solve it, all right? I'm working on it. Harry watched Neville leave. Of course, Harry hadn't said what the solution was. The solution, obviously, was to hurry up and become God. Neville's footsteps moved off, and soon could no longer be heard. And then there was one. Ahem, said Severus Snape's voice from directly behind him. Harry let out a small scream and instantly hated himself. Slowly, Harry turned around. The tall, greasy man in the spotted robes was leaning against the wall in the same position Harry had occupied. A fine invisibility cloak, Potter, drawled the potion's master. Much is explained. Oh, bloody crap. And perhaps I have been in Dumbledore's company too long, said Severus, but I cannot help but wonder if that is the cloak of invisibility. Harry immediately turned into someone who'd never heard of the cloak of invisibility and who was exactly as smart as Harry thought Severus thought Harry was. Oh, possibly, said Harry. I trust you realize the implications if it is? Severus's voice was condescending. You have no idea what I'm talking about, do you, Potter? A rather clumsy try at fishing. Professor Quirrell had remarked over their lunch that Harry really needed to conceal his state of mind better than putting on a blank face when someone discussed a dangerous topic, and had explained about one-level deceptions, two-level deceptions, and so on. So either Severus was in fact modeling Harry as a one-level player, which made Severus himself two-level, and Harry's three-level move had been successful, or Severus was a four-level player and wanted Harry to think the deception had been successful. Harry, smiling, had asked Professor Quirrell what level he played at, and Professor Quirrell, also smiling, had responded, "One level higher than you." "So you were watching this whole time," said Harry. "Disillusionment, I think it's called." A thin smile. "It would have been foolish of me to take the slightest risk that you came to harm. And you wanted to see the results of your test firsthand," said Harry.
"So,
am I like my father's?" A strange, sad expression came over the man, one that looked foreign to his face. "I should sooner say, Harry Potter, that you resemble Dash." Severus stopped short. He stared at Harry. "Lestrange called you a son of a mudblood," Severus said slowly. "It didn't seem to bother you much." Harry furrowed his eyebrows. Not under those circumstances, no. You just helped him, Severus said. His eyes were intent on Harry, and he threw it back in your face. Surely that isn't something you'd just forgive. He'd just been through a pretty harrowing experience, Harry said. And I don't think being rescued by first years helped his pride much, either. I suppose it was easy enough to forgive, Severus said, and his voice was odd, since Lestrange means nothing to you. Just some strange Slytherin. If it was a friend, perhaps you would have felt far more injured by what he said. If he were a friend, Harry said, all the more reason to forgive him. There was a long silence. Harry felt, and he couldn't have said why or from where, that the air was filling up with a dreadful tension, like water rising and rising and rising. Then Severus smiled, looking suddenly relaxed once more, and all the tension vanished. You are a very forgiving person, Severus said, still smiling. I suppose your stepfather, Michael Vers Evans, was the one who taught it to you. More like Dad's science fiction and fantasy collection, said Harry. Sort of my fifth parent, really. I've lived the lives of all the characters in all my books, and all their mighty wisdom thunders in my head. Somewhere in there was someone like Lesseth, I expect, though I couldn't say who. It wasn't hard to put myself in his shoes. And it was my books that told me what to do about it, too. The good guys forgive. Severus gave a light, amused laugh. I'm afraid I wouldn't know much about what good people do. Harry looked at him. That was kind of sad, actually. I'll lend you some novels with good people in them, if you like. I should like to ask your advice about something, Severus said, his voice casual. I know of another fifth-year Slytherin who is being bullied by Gryffindors. He was wooing a beautiful Muggle-born girl who came across him being bullied and tried to rescue him. And he called her a mudblood, and that was the end for them. He apologized many times, but she never forgave him. Have you any thoughts for what he could have said or done to win from her the forgiveness you gave Lestrange? Harry said, based on only that information, I'm not sure he was the main one who had a problem. I'd have told him not to date someone that incapable of forgiveness. Suppose they'd gotten married. Can you imagine life in that household? There was a pause. Oh, but she could forgive, Severus said with amusement in his voice. Why, afterward, she went off and became the girlfriend of the bully. Tell me, why would she forgive the bully and not the bullied? Harry shrugged. At a wild guess, because the bully had hurt someone else very badly, and the bullied had hurt her just a little, and to her that just felt far more unforgivable somehow. Or, not to put too fine a point on it, was the bully handsome? Or for that matter, rich? There was another pause. Yes to both, said Severus. And there you have it, said Harry. Not that I've ever been through high school myself, but my books give me to understand that there's a certain kind of teenage girl who'll be outraged by a single insult if the boy is plain or poor, yet who can somehow find room in her heart to forgive a rich and handsome boy his bullying. She was shallow, in other words. Tell whoever it was that she wasn't worthy of him, and he needs to get over it and move on, and next time date girls who are deep instead of pretty. Severus stared at Harry in silence, his eyes glittering. The smile had faded, and though Severus's face twitched, it did not return. Harry was starting to feel a bit nervous. Not that I've got any experience in the area myself, obviously, but I think that's what a wise advisor from my books would say. There was more silence and more glittering. It was probably a good time to change the subject. So, Harry said, did I pass your test, whatever it was? I think, Severus said, that there should be no more conversations between us, Potter, and you would be exceedingly wise never to speak of this one. Harry blinked. Would you mind telling me what I did wrong? You offended me, said Severus. And I no longer trust your cunning. Harry stared at Severus, taken rather aback. "But you have given me well-meant advice," said Severus Snape, "and so I will give you true advice in return." His voice was almost perfectly steady, like a string stretched almost perfectly horizontal, despite the massive weight hanging from its middle by 1,000,000 tons of tension pulling at either end. "You almost died today, Potter. In the future, never share your wisdom with anyone unless you know exactly what you are both talking about." Harry's mind finally made the connection. "You were that dash." Harry's mouth snapped shut as the almost died part sank in, 2 seconds too late. "Yes," said Severus, "I was..." And the terrible tension flooded back into the room like water pressurized at the bottom of the ocean. Harry couldn't breathe.
Lose. Now.
"I didn't know," Harry whispered. "I'm S dash." "No," said Severus. Just that one word. Harry stood there in silence, his mind frantically searching for options. Severus stood between him and the window, which was a real pity, because a fall from that height wouldn't kill a wizard. "Your books betrayed you, Potter," said Severus, still in that voice stretched tight by 1,000,000 tons of pull. "They did not tell you the one thing you needed to know. You cannot learn from stories what it is like to lose the one you love. That is something you could never understand without feeling it yourself." "My father," Harry whispered. It was his best guess, the one thing that might save him. "My father tried to protect you from the bullies." A ghastly smile stretched across Severus's face, and the man moved toward Harry.
And past him.
"Goodbye, Potter," said Severus, not looking back on his way out. "We shall have little to say to each other from today on." And at the corner, the man stopped, and without turning, spoke one final time. "Your father was the bully," said Severus Snape, "and what your mother saw in him was something I never did understand until this day." He left. Harry turned and walked toward the window. His shaking hands went onto the ledge. "Never give anyone wise advice unless you know exactly what you're both talking about."
Got it.
Harry stared out at the clouds and the light drizzle for a while. The window looked out on the east grounds, and it was afternoon, so if the sun was visible through the clouds at all, Harry couldn't see it. His hands had stopped shaking, but there was a tight feeling in Harry's chest, like it was being compressed by metal bands. So his father had been a bully, and his mother had been shallow. Maybe they'd grown up later. Good people like Professor McGonagall did seem to think the world of them, and it might not be only because they were heroic martyrs. Of course, that was scant consolation when you were 11 and about to turn into a teenager, and wondering what sort of teenager you might become. So very terrible.
So very sad.
Such an awful life Harry led. Learning that his genetic parents hadn't been perfect. Why, he ought to spend a while moping about that, feeling sorry for himself. Maybe he could complain till Lessif Lestrange. Harry had read about Dementors. Cold and darkness surrounded them, and fear. They sucked away all your happy thoughts, and in that absence, all your worst memories rose to the surface. He could imagine himself in Lessith's shoes, knowing that his parents were in Azkaban for life, that place from which no one had ever escaped. And Lessith would be imagining himself in his mother's place, in the cold and the darkness and the fear, alone with all of her worst memories, even in her dreams, every second of every day. For an instant, Harry imagined his own mom and dad in Azkaban, with the Dementors sucking out their life, draining away the happy memories of their love for him. Just for an instant, before his imagination blew a fuse and called an emergency shutdown and told him never to imagine that again. Was it right to do that to anyone, even the second most evil person in the world? No, said the wisdom of Harry's books. Not if there's any other way at all. And unless the wizarding justice system was as perfect as their prisons, and that sounded rather improbable, all things considered, somewhere in Azkaban was a person who was entirely innocent, and probably more than one. There was a burning sensation in Harry's throat and moisture gathering in his eyes, and he wanted to teleport all of Azkaban's prisoners to safety and call down fire from the sky and blast that terrible place down to bedrock. But he couldn't because he wasn't God. And Harry remembered what Professor Quirrell had said beneath the starlight. Sometimes, when this flawed world seems unusually hateful, I wonder whether there might be some other place, far away, where I should have been. But the stars are so very, very far away, and I wonder what I would dream about if I slept for a long, long time. Right now, this flawed world seemed unusually hateful. And Harry couldn't understand Professor Quirrell's words. It might have been an alien that had spoken, or an artificial intelligence, something built along such different lines from Harry that his brain couldn't be forced to operate in that mode. You couldn't leave your home planet while it still contained a place like Azkaban. You had to stay and fight. 28. Reductionism. Okay, Harry said, swallowing. Okay, Hermione, it's enough. You can stop. The white sugar pill in front of Hermione still hadn't changed shape or color at all. Even though she was concentrating harder than Harry had ever seen, her eyes squeezed shut, beads of sweat on her forehead, hand trembling as it gripped the wand. Hermione, stop. It's not going to work, Hermione. I don't think we can make things that don't exist yet. Slowly, Hermione's hand relaxed its grasp on the wand. I thought I felt it, she said in a bare whisper. I thought I felt it start to transfigure, just for a second. There was a lump in Harry's throat. You were probably imagining it, hoping too hard. I probably was, she said. She looked like she wanted to cry. Slowly, Harry took his mechanical pencil in his hand and reached over to the sheet of paper with all the items crossed out and drew a line through the item that said Alzheimer's cure. They couldn't have fed anyone a transfigured pill. But transfiguration, at least the kind they could do, didn't enchant the targets. It wouldn't transfigure a regular broomstick into a flying one. So, if Hermione had been able to make a pill at all, it would have been a non-magical pill, one that worked for ordinary material reasons. They could have secretly made pills for a Muggle science lab, let them study the pills, and try to reverse engineer them before the transfiguration wore off. No one in either world would need to know that magic had been involved. It would just be another scientific breakthrough. It hadn't been the sort of thing a wizard would think of, either. They didn't respect mere patterns of atoms that much. They didn't think of unenchanted material things as objects of power. If it wasn't magical, it wasn't interesting. Earlier, Harry had very secretly, he hadn't even told Hermione, tried to transfigure nanotechnology a la Eric Drexler. He tried to produce a desktop nanofactory, of course, not tiny self-replicating assemblers. Harry wasn't insane. It would have been godhood in a single shot if it had worked. That was it for today, right? Said Hermione. She was slumped back in her chair, leaning her head against the back, and her face showed her tiredness, which was very unusual for Hermione. She liked to pretend she was limitless, at least when Harry was around. One more, Harry said cautiously, but that one's small, plus it might actually work. I saved it for last because I was hoping we could end on an up note. It's real stuff, not like phasers. They've already made it in the laboratory, not like the Alzheimer's cure. And it's a generic substance, not specific like the lost books you tried to transfigure copies of. I made a diagram of the molecular structure to show you. We just want to make it longer than it's ever been made before, and with all the tubes aligned and the endpoints embedded in diamond, Harry produced a sheet of graph paper. Hermione sat back up, took it, and studied it, frowning. These are all carbon atoms? And Harry, what's the name? I can't transfigure it if I don't know what it's called. Harry made a disgusted face. He was still having trouble getting used to that sort of thing. It shouldn't matter what something was named if you knew what it was. They're called Bucky tubes or carbon nanotubes. It's a kind of fullerene that was discovered just this year. It's about 100 times stronger than steel, and a sixth of the weight. Hermione looked up from the graph paper, her face surprised. That's real? Yeah, Harry said, just hard to make the muggle way. If we could get enough of the stuff, we could use it to build a space elevator all the way up to geosynchronous orbit or higher, and in terms of delta V, that's halfway to anywhere in the solar system. Plus, we could throw out solar power satellites, like confetti. Hermione was frowning again. Is this stuff safe? I don't see why it wouldn't be, Harry said. A bucky tube is just a graphite sheet wrapped into a circular tube, basically, and graphite is the same stuff used in pencils. I know what graphite is, Harry, Hermione said. She brushed her hair back absent-mindedly, her eyebrows furrowed as she stared at the sheet of paper. Harry reached into a pocket of his robes and produced a white thread tied to two small gray plastic rings at either end. He'd added drops of superglue where the thread met either ring to make it all a single object that could be transfigured as a whole. Cyanoacrylate, if Harry remembered correctly, worked by covalent bonds, and that was as close to being a solid object as you ever got in a world ultimately composed of tiny individual atoms. When you're ready, Harry said, try to transfigure this into a set of aligned bucky tube fibers embedded in two solid diamond rings. All right, Hermione said slowly. Harry, I feel like I just missed something. Harry shrugged helplessly. Maybe you're just tired. He knew better than to say it out loud, though. Hermione laid her wand against one plastic ring and stared for a while. Two small circles of glittering diamond lay on the table, connected by a long black thread. It changed, said Hermione. She sounded like she was trying to be enthusiastic, but had run out of energy. Now what? Harry felt a bit deflated by his research partner's lack of passion, but did his best not to show it. Maybe the same process would work in reverse to cheer her up. Now I tested to see if it holds weight. There was an A-frame Harry had rigged up to do an earlier experiment with diamond rods. You could make solid diamond objects easily. Using Transfiguration, they just wouldn't last. The earlier experiment had measured whether transfiguring a long diamond rod into a shorter diamond rod would allow it to lift a suspended heavy weight as it contracted, i.e., could you transfigure against tension, which you in fact could. Harry carefully looped one circle of glittering diamond over the thick metal hook at the top of the rig, then attached a thick metal hanger to the bottom ring, and then started attaching weights to the hanger. Harry had asked the Weasley twins to transfigure the apparatus for him, and the Weasley twins had given him an incredulous look, like they couldn't figure out what sort of prank he could possibly want that for, but they hadn't asked any questions. And their transfigurations, according to them, lasted for around 3 hours, so Harry and Hermione still had a while left. 100 kilograms, Harry said about a minute later. I don't think a steel thread this thin would hold that. It should go up much higher, but that's all the weight I've got. There was a further silence. Harry straightened up and went back to their table and sat down in his chair and ceremoniously made a check mark next to bucky tubes. There, Harry said. That one worked, but it's not really useful, Harry, is it? Hermione said from where she was sitting with her head resting in her hands. I mean, even if we gave it to a scientist, they couldn't learn how to make lots of bucky tubes from studying ours. They might be able to learn something, Harry said. Hermione, look at it, that little tiny thread holding up all that weight. We just made something that no Muggle laboratory could make dash. But any other witch could make it, Hermione said. Her exhaustion was coming into her voice. Now, Harry, I don't think this is working out. You mean our relationship? Harry said. Great. Let's break up. That got a slight grin out of her. I mean our research. Oh, Hermione, how could you? You're sweet when you're mean, she said. But Harry, this is nuts. I'm 12, you're 11. It's silly to think we're going to discover anything that no one's ever figured out before. Are you really saying we should give up on unraveling the secrets of magic after trying for less than 1 month? Harry said, trying to put a note of challenge into his voice. Honestly, he was feeling some of the same fatigue as Hermione. None of the good ideas ever worked. He'd made just one discovery worth mentioning, the Mendelian pattern, and he couldn't tell Hermione about it without breaking his promise to Draco. No, Hermione said. Her young face was looking very serious and adult. I'm saying right now we should be studying all the magic that wizards already know, so we can do this sort of thing after we graduate from Hogwarts. Harry said. Hermione, I hate to put it this way, but imagine we decided to hold off on research until later, and the first thing we tried after we graduated was transfiguring an Alzheimer's cure, and it worked. We'd feel. I don't think the word stupid would adequately describe how we'd feel. What if there's something else like that, and it does work? That's not fair, Harry's. Hermione said. Her voice was trembling, like she was on the verge of breaking out crying. You can't put that on people. It's not our job to do that sort of thing. We're kids. For a moment, Harry wondered what would happen if someone told Hermione she had to fight an immortal Dark Lord, if she would turn into one of the whiny, self-pitying heroes that Harry could never stand reading about in his books. Anyway, Hermione said. Her voice shook. I don't want to keep doing this. I don't believe children can do things that grown-ups can't. That's only in stories. There was silence in the classroom. Hermione started to look a little scared, and Harry knew that his own expression had gotten colder. It might not have hurt so much if the same thought hadn't already come to Harry, that, while 30 might be old for a scientific revolutionary and 20 about right, while there were people who got doctorates when they were 17 and 14-year-old heirs who'd been great kings or generals, there wasn't really anyone who'd made the history books at 11. All right, Harry said. Figure out how to do something a grown-up can't. Is that your challenge? I didn't mean it like that, Hermione said, her voice coming out in a frightened whisper. With an effort, Harry wrenched his gaze away from Hermione. I'm not angry at you, Harry said. His voice was cold, despite his best efforts. I'm angry at, I don't know, everything. But I'm not willing to lose, Hermione. Losing isn't always the right thing to do. I'll figure out how to do something a grown wizard can't do, and then I'll get back to you. How's that? There was more silence. Okay, said Hermione, her voice wavering a little. She pushed herself up out of her chair and went over to the door of the abandoned classroom they'd been working in. Her hand went onto the doorknob. We're still friends, right? And if you can't figure out anything, dash. Her voice halted. Then we'll study together, Harry said. His voice was even colder now. Bye for now, then, Hermione said, and she quickly went out of the room and shut the door behind her. Sometimes Harry hated having a dark side, even when he was inside it. And the part of him that had thought exactly the same thing as Hermione, that no, children couldn't do what grown-ups couldn't, was saying all the things that Hermione had been too frightened to say, like, that's one hell of a difficult challenge you just grabbed for yourself, and boy are you going to end up with egg on your face this time, and at least this way you'll know you failed. And the part of him that didn't enjoy losing replied in a very cold voice, fine, you can shut up and watch. It was almost lunchtime, and Harry didn't care. He hadn't even bothered grabbing a snack bar from his pouch. His stomach could stand a little starving. The wizarding world was tiny. They didn't think like scientists. They didn't know science. They didn't question what they'd grown up with. They hadn't put protective shells on their time. Machines, they played Quidditch. All of magical Britain was smaller than a small Muggle city. The greatest wizarding school only educated up to the age of 17. Silly wasn't challenging that at 11. Silly was assuming wizards knew what they were doing and had already exhausted all the low-hanging fruit a scientific polymath would see. Step 1 had been to make a list of every magical constraint Harry could remember, all the things you supposedly couldn't do. Step 2, mark the constraints that seemed to make the least sense from a scientific perspective. Step 3, Prioritize constraints that a wizard would be unlikely to question if they didn't know science. Step 4. Come up with avenues for attacking them. Hermione still felt a little shaky as she sat down next to Mandy at the Ravenclaw table. Hermione's lunch had 2 fruits, tomato slices and peeled tangerines, 3 vegetables, carrots, and more carrots, 1 meat, fried Duracell drumsticks whose unhealthy coating she would carefully remove, and 1 little piece of chocolate cake that she would earn by eating the other parts. It hadn't been as bad as potions class. Sometimes she still had nightmares about that. But this time she had made it happen, and she'd felt like its target. Just for a moment, before the terrible cold darkness looked away and said it wasn't angry with her, because it hadn't wanted to scare her. And she still had that feeling like she'd missed something earlier, something really important. But they hadn't violated any of the rules of Transfiguration, had they? They hadn't made any liquids, any gases, they hadn't taken orders from the defense professor. The pill. That had been something to be eaten. Well, no, nobody would just eat a pill lying around. It hadn't worked actually, they could have just finite incantated it if it had, but she would still have to tell Harry about that, and make sure they didn't mention it in front of Professor McGonagall, in case they were never allowed to study Transfiguration again. Hermione was starting to get a really sick feeling in her stomach. She pushed back her plate from the table. She couldn't eat lunch like this. And she closed her eyes and began to mentally recite the rules of Transfiguration. I will never transfigure anything into liquid or gas. I will never transfigure anything that looks like food or anything else that goes inside a human body. No, they really shouldn't have tried to transfigure the pill, or they should have at least realized. She'd been so caught up in Harry's brilliant idea that she hadn't thought. The sick feeling in Hermione's stomach was getting worse. There was a feeling in her mind of something hovering just on the edge of recognition, a perception about to invert itself, a young woman about to become a crone, a vase about to become 2 faces. And she went on remembering the rules of Transfiguration. Harry's knuckles had gone white on his wand by the time he stopped trying to transfigure the air in front of his wand into a paperclip. It wouldn't have been safe to transfigure the paperclip into gas, of course, but Harry didn't see any reason why it would be unsafe the other way around. It just wasn't supposed to be possible. But why not? Air was as real a substance as anything else. Well, maybe that limitation did make sense. Air was disorganized, all the molecules constantly changing their relation to each other. Maybe you couldn't impose a new form on substance unless the substance was staying still long enough for you to master it, even though the atoms in solids were also constantly vibrating all the time. The more Harry failed, the colder he felt, the clearer everything seemed to become. All right, next on the list. You could only transfigure whole objects as wholes. You couldn't transfigure half a match into a needle, you had to transfigure the whole thing. Back when Harry had been trapped in that classroom by Draco, it had been the reason he couldn't just transfigure a thin cylindrical cross-section of the walls into sponge and punch out a chunk of stone large enough for him to fit through the hole. He would have needed to impose a new form on the whole wall and maybe a whole section of Hogwarts just in order to change that little cross-section. And that was ridiculous. Things were made of atoms. Lots of little tiny dots. There was no contiguity, there was no solidity, just electromagnetic forces holding the little dots related to each other. Mandy Brocklehurst paused with her fork on her way to her mouth. Huh, she said to Sue Lee, sitting across from the now empty space beside her. What got into Hermione? Harry wanted to kill his eraser. He'd been trying to change a single spot on the pink rectangle into steel, apart from the rest of the rubber, and the eraser wasn't cooperating. It had to be a conceptual limitation, not a real one. Had to be. Things were made of atoms, and every atom was a tiny separate thing. Atoms were held together by a quantum mist of shared electrons, for covalent bonds, or sometimes just magnetism at close ranges, for ionic bonds or van der Waals forces. If it came down to that, the protons and neutrons inside the nuclei were tiny separate things. The quarks inside the protons and neutrons were tiny separate things. There simply wasn't anything in reality, the world out there, that corresponded to people's conceit of solid objects. It was all just little dots. And free transfiguration was all in the mind to begin with, wasn't it? No words, no gestures. Only the pure concept of form, kept strictly separate from substance, imposed on the substance, conceived of apart from its form. That, and the wand, and whatever made you a wizard. The wizards couldn't transform parts of things, could only transform what their minds perceived as wholes, because they didn't know in their bones that it was all just atoms deep down. Harry had focused on that knowledge as hard as he could, the true fact that the eraser was just a collection of atoms. Everything was just collections of atoms, and the atoms of the little patch he was trying to transfigure formed just as valid a collection as any other collection he cared to think about. And Harry still hadn't been able to change that single part of the eraser. The transfiguration wasn't going anywhere.
This was
ridiculous. Harry's knuckles were whitening on his wand again. He was sick of getting experimental results that didn't make sense. Maybe the fact that some part of his mind was still thinking in terms of objects was stopping the transfiguration from going through. He had thought of a collection of atoms that was an eraser. He had thought of a collection that was a little patch. Time to kick it up a notch. Harry pressed his wand harder against that tiny section of eraser and tried to see through the illusion that non-scientists thought was reality, the world of desks and chairs, air and erasers and people. When you walked through a park, the immersive world that surrounded you was something that existed inside your own brain as a pattern of neurons firing. The sensation of a bright blue sky wasn't something high above you, it was something in your visual cortex, and your visual cortex was in the back of your brain. All the sensations of that bright world were really happening in that quiet cave of bone you called your skull, the place where you lived and never, ever left. If you really wanted to say hello to someone, to the actual person, you wouldn't shake their hand. You'd knock gently on their skull and say, "How are you doing in there?" That was what people were. That was where they really lived. And the picture of the park that you thought you were walking through was something that was visualized inside your brain as it processed the signals sent down from your eyes and retina. It wasn't a lie like the Buddhists thought. There wasn't something terribly mystical and unexpected behind the veil of Maya. What lay beyond the illusion of the park was just the actual park, but it was all still illusion. Harry wasn't sitting inside the classroom. He wasn't looking at the eraser. Harry was inside Harry's skull. He was experiencing a processed picture his brain had decoded from the signals sent down by his retina. The real eraser was somewhere else, somewhere that wasn't the picture. And the real eraser wasn't like the picture Harry's brain had of it. The idea of the eraser as a solid object was something that existed only inside his own brain, inside the parietal cortex that processed his sense of shape and space. The real eraser was a collection of atoms held together by electromagnetic forces and shared covalent electrons, while nearby, air molecules bounced off each other and bounced off the eraser molecules. The real eraser was far away, and Harry, inside his skull, could never quite touch it, could only imagine ideas about it. But his wand had the power. It could change things out there in reality. It was only Harry's own preconceptions that were limiting it. Somewhere beyond the veil of Maya, the truth behind Harry's concept of my wand was touching the collection of atoms that Harry's mind thought of as a patch on the eraser. And if that wand could change the collection of atoms that Harry considered the whole eraser, there was absolutely no reason why it couldn't change the other collection too. The transfiguration still wasn't going through. Harry's teeth clenched together, and he kicked it up another notch. The concept Harry's mind had of the eraser as a single object was obvious nonsense. It was a map that didn't and couldn't match the territory. Human beings modeled the world using stratified levels of organization, They had separate thoughts about how countries worked, how people worked, how organs worked, how cells worked, how molecules worked, how quarks worked. When Harry's brain needed to think about the eraser, it would think about the rules that governed erasers, like erasers can get rid of pencil marks. Only if Harry's brain needed to predict what would happen on the lower chemical level, only then would Harry's brain start thinking, as though it were a separate fact, about rubber molecules. But that was all in the mind. Harry's mind might have separate beliefs about rules that govern erasers, but there was no separate law of physics that govern erasers. Harry's mind modeled reality using multiple levels of organization, with different beliefs about each level. But that was all in the map. The true territory wasn't like that. Reality itself had only a single level of organization. The quarks was a unified low-level process obeying mathematically simple rules. Or at least that was what Harry had believed before he'd found out about magic. But the eraser wasn't magical. And even if the eraser had been magical, the idea that there could really exist a single solid eraser was impossible. Things like erasers couldn't be basic elements of reality. They were too big and complicated to be atoms. They had to be made of parts. You couldn't have things that were fundamentally complicated. The implicit belief that Harry's brain had in the eraser as a single object wasn't just wrong. It was a map territory confusion. The eraser only existed as a separate concept in Harry's multi-level model of the world, not as a separate element of single-level reality. The Transfiguration still wasn't happening. Harry was breathing heavily. Failed Transfiguration was almost as tiring as successful Transfiguration, but damned if he'd give up now. All right, screw this 19th century garbage. Reality wasn't atoms. It wasn't a set of tiny billiard balls bopping around. That was just another lie. The notion of atoms as little dots was just another convenient hallucination that people clung to because they didn't want to confront the inhumanly alien shape of the underlying reality. No wonder, then, that his attempts to transfigure based on that hadn't worked. If he wanted power, he had to abandon his humanity and force his thoughts to conform to the true math of quantum mechanics. There were no particles. There were just clouds of amplitude in a multi-particle configuration space, and what his brain fondly imagined to be an eraser was nothing except a gigantic factor in a wave function that happened to factorize. It didn't have a separate existence any more than there was a particular solid factor of 3 hidden inside the number 6. If his wand was capable of altering factors in an approximately factorizable wave function, then it should damn well be able to alter the slightly smaller factor that Harry's brain visualized as a patch of material on the eraser. Hermione tore through the hallways, shoes pounding hard on the stone, breath coming in pants, the shock of adrenaline still racing through her blood. Like a picture of a young woman turning into an old crone, like the cup becoming 2 faces. What had they been doing? What had they been doing? She came to the classroom and her fingers slipped on the doorknob at first. Too sweaty. She grabbed harder and the door opened. In a single flash of perception, she saw Harry staring at a small pink rectangle on the table in front of him. As a few paces away, the tiny black thread, almost invisible from this distance, supported all that weight. Harry, get out of the classroom. Pure shock crossed Harry's face, and he stood up so fast he almost fell over, stopping only to grab the small pink rectangle from the table, and he tore out of the door. She'd already stepped aside. Her wand was already in her hand, coming up pointing at the thread. Finite incantatum. And Hermione slammed the door shut again, just as the gigantic crash of 100 kilograms of falling metal came from inside. She was panting, gasping for air. She'd run all the way here without stopping. She was soaked in sweat and her legs and thighs burned like living flames. She couldn't have answered Harry's questions for all the galleons in the world. Hermione blinked and realized that she had started to fall, and Harry had caught her and was lowering her gently to sit on the floor. "Healthy," she managed to whisper. "What?" said Harry, looking paler than she'd ever seen him. "Are you feeling healthy?" Harry started looking even more frightened as the question sank in. I don't think I have any symptoms, Dash." Hermione closed her eyes for a moment. "Good," she whispered. "Catch breath." That took a while. Harry was still looking scared. That was good too. Maybe it would teach him a lesson. Hermione reached into the pouch Harry had bought her, whispered water through her parched throat, took out the bottle and drank in great, huge gulps. And then it was still a while before she could talk again. "We broke the rules, Harry," she said in a hoarse voice. "We broke the rules." Harry swallowed. "I still don't see how. I've been thinking, but Dash asked if the Transfiguration was safe, and you answered me." There was a pause. "That's it," Harry said. She could have screamed. "Harry, don't you get it?" she said. "It's made out of tiny fibers. What if it unraveled? Who knows what could go wrong? We didn't ask Professor McGonagall. Don't you see what we were doing? We were experimenting with Transfiguration." "We were experimenting with Transfiguration." There was another pause. "Right?" Harry said slowly. "That's probably one of those things they don't even bother telling you not to do, because it's too obvious. Don't test brilliant new ideas for Transfiguration by yourselves in an unused classroom without consulting any professors. You could have gotten us killed, Harry." Hermione knew it wasn't fair. She'd made the mistake too, but she still felt angry at him. He always sounded so confident, and that had dragged her unthinkingly along in his wake. "We could have spoiled Professor McGonagall's perfect record." "Yes," said Harry. "Let's not tell her about this, shall we?" "We have to stop," Hermione said. "We have to stop this, or we're going to get hurt. We're too young, Harry. We can't do this. Not yet." A weak grin crossed Harry's face. You're sort of wrong about that." And he held out a small pink rectangle, a rubber eraser with a bright metal patch on it. Hermione stared at it, puzzled. "Quantum mechanics wasn't enough," Harry said. "I had to go all the way down to timeless physics before it took. Had to see the wand as enforcing a relation between separate past and future realities, instead of changing anything over time. But I did it, Hermione. I saw past the illusion of objects, and I bet there's not a single other wizard in the world who could have. Even if some Muggleborn knew about timeless formulations of quantum mechanics, it would just be a weird belief about strange, distant quantum stuff. They wouldn't see that it was reality, except that the world they knew was just a hallucination. I transfigured part of the eraser, without changing the whole thing." Hermione raised her wand again, pointed it at the eraser. For a moment, anger crossed Harry's face, but he didn't make any move to stop her. "Finite incantatum," said Hermione. "Check with Professor McGonagall before you try it again." Harry nodded, though his face was still a bit tight. "And we still have to stop," said Hermione. "Why?" said Harry. "Don't you see what this means, Hermione? Wizards don't know everything. There's too few of them. Even fewer who know any science. They haven't exhausted the low-hanging fruit, Dash. It's not safe," Hermione said. "If we can find out new things, it's even less safe. We're too young. We made one big mistake already. Next time we could just die." Then Hermione flinched. Harry looked away from her and started taking slow, deep breaths. "Please don't try to do it alone, Harry," Hermione said, her voice trembling. "Please don't make me have to decide whether to tell Professor Flitwick." There was a long pause. "So you want us to study?" Harry said. She could tell he was trying to keep the anger out of his voice. "Just study?" Hermione wasn't sure if she should say anything, but, "Like you studied, timeless physics, right?" Harry looked back at her. "That thing you did," Hermione said, her voice tentative, "it wasn't because of our experiments, right? You could do it because you'd read lots of books." Harry opened his mouth, and then he shut it again. There was a frustrated look on his face. "All right," Harry said. How about this? We study, and if I think of anything that seems really worth trying, we'll try it after I ask a professor. Okay, Hermione said. She didn't fall over with relief, but only because she was already sitting down. Shall we get lunch? Harry said cautiously. Hermione nodded.
Yes.
Lunch sounded good. For real, this time. She carefully began to push herself off the stone floor, wincing as her body screamed at her. Harry pointed his wand at her and said, Wingardium Leviosa. Hermione blinked as the huge weight on her legs diminished to something bearable. A smile quirked across Harry's face. You can lift something without being able to hover it completely, he said. Remember that experiment? Hermione smiled back helplessly, although she thought she ought to still be angry. And she started walking back toward the Great Hall, feeling remarkably and wonderfully light on her feet, as Harry carefully kept his wand trained on her. He only managed to keep it up for 5 minutes, but it was the thought that counted. Minerva looked at Dumbledore. Dumbledore gazed back inquiringly at her. Did you understand any of that? The headmaster said, sounding bemused. It had been the most complete and utter gibberish that Minerva could ever remember hearing. She was feeling a bit embarrassed about having summoned the headmaster to hear it, but she'd been given explicit instructions. I'm afraid not, Professor McGonagall said primly. So, Dumbledore said. The silver beard swung away from her. The old wizard's twinkling gaze looked elsewhere once more. You suspect you might be able to do something that other wizards can't do, something we think is impossible. The three of them stood within the headmaster's private Transfiguration workroom, where the shining phoenix of Dumbledore's Patronus had told her to bring Harry, moments after her own Patronus had reached him. Light shone down through the skylights and illuminated the great 7-pointed alchemical diagram drawn in the center of the circular room, showing it to be a little dusty, which saddened Minerva. Transfiguration research was one of Dumbledore's great enjoyments, and she'd known how pressed for time he'd been lately, but not that he was this pressed. And now Harry Potter was going to waste even more of the headmaster's time. But she certainly couldn't blame Harry for that. He'd done the proper thing in coming to her to say that he'd had an idea for doing something in Transfiguration that was currently believed to be impossible, and she herself had done exactly what she'd been told to do. She'd ordered Harry to be quiet and not discuss anything with her until she had consulted the headmaster, and they'd finished moving to a secure location. If Harry had started out by saying what specifically he thought he could do, she wouldn't have bothered. Look, I know it's hard to explain, Harry said, sounding a little embarrassed. What it adds up to is that what you believe conflicts with what scientists believe, in a case where I genuinely expect scientists to know more than wizards. Minerva would have sighed out loud if Dumbledore hadn't seemed to be taking the whole thing very seriously. Harry's idea stemmed from simple ignorance, nothing more. If you changed half of a metal ball into glass, the whole ball had a different form. To change the part was to change the whole, and that meant removing the whole form and replacing it with a different one. What would it even mean to transfigure only half of a metal ball? That the metal ball as a whole had the same form as before, but half that ball now had a different form? Mr. Potter, said Professor McGonagall, what you want to do isn't just impossible, it's illogical. If you change half of something, you did change the whole. Indeed, said Dumbledore. But Harry is the hero, so he may be able to do things that are logically impossible. Minerva would have rolled her eyes if she hadn't gone numb a long time ago. Supposing it was possible, said Dumbledore, can you think of any reason why the results would differ in any way from ordinary transfiguration? Minerva frowned. The fact that the concept was literally unimaginable was presenting her. With some difficulty, but she tried to take it at face value. A transfiguration imposed on only half of a metal ball. Strange things happening at the interface, said Minerva. But that should be no different than transfiguring the object as a whole into a form with two different parts. Dumbledore nodded. That is my own thought as well. And Harry, if your theory is correct, it implies that what you want to do is exactly like any other transfiguration, only applied to a part of the subject rather than the whole? No changes at all. Yes, Harry said firmly. That's the whole point. Dumbledore looked at her again. Minerva, can you think of any reason whatsoever why that would be dangerous? No, said Minerva, after she had finished searching through her memory. Likewise myself, said the headmaster. All right then. Since this ought to be exactly analogous to ordinary transfiguration in all respects, and since we cannot think of any reason whatsoever why it would be dangerous, I think that the second degree of caution will suffice. Minerva was surprised, but she didn't object. Dumbledore was by far her senior in Transfiguration, and he had tried literally thousands of new transfigurations without ever choosing a degree of caution that was too low. He had used Transfiguration in combat, and he was still alive. If the headmaster thought the second degree was enough, it was enough. That Harry was certainly going to fail was, of course, completely irrelevant. The two of them started setting up the wards and detection webs. The most important web was the one that checked to make sure no transfigured material had entered the air. Harry would be enclosed in a separate shell of force with its own air supply just to be certain, only his wand allowed to leave the shield, and the interface tight. They were inside Hogwarts, so they couldn't automatically apparate out any material that showed signs of spontaneous combustion, but they could launch it out a skylight almost as fast, the windows all folded outward for exactly that reason. Harry himself would go out a different skylight at the first sign of trouble. Harry watched them working, his face looking a little frightened. Don't worry, said Professor McGonagall in the middle of her running description. This almost certainly won't be necessary, Mr. Potter. If we expected anything to go wrong, you would not be allowed to try. It's just ordinary precautions for any transfiguration no one has ever tried before. Harry swallowed and nodded. And a few minutes later, Harry was strapped into the safety chair and resting his wand against a metal ball, one that, based on his current test scores, should have been too large for him to transfigure in less than 30 minutes. And a few minutes after that, Minerva was leaning against the wall, feeling faint. There was a small patch of glass on the ball where Harry's wand had rested. Harry didn't say, "I told you so," but the smug look on his sweating face said it for him. Dumbledore was casting analytic charms on the ball, looking more and more intrigued by the moment. 30 years had melted off his face. Fascinating, said Dumbledore. It's exactly as he claimed. He simply transfigured a part of the subject without transfiguring the whole. You say it's really just a conceptual limitation, Harry's? Yes, Harry said, but a deep one. Just knowing it had to be a conceptual limitation wasn't enough. I had to suppress the part of my mind that was making the error and think instead about the underlying reality that scientists figured out. Truly fascinating, Dumbledore said. I take it that for any other wizard to do the same would require months of study, if they could do it at all? And may I ask you to partially transfigure some other subjects? Probably yes, and of course, Harry said. Half an hour later, Minerva was feeling equally bewildered, but considerably reassured about the safety issues. It was the same, aside from being logically impossible. I believe that's enough, Headmaster, Minerva said finally. I suspect partial transfiguration is more tiring than the ordinary sort. Getting less so with practice, said the exhausted and pale boy, voice unsteady. But yeah, you've got that right. The process of extracting Harry from the wards took another minute, and then Minerva escorted him to a much more comfortable chair, and Dumbledore produced an ice cream soda. Congratulations, Mr. Potter, said Professor McGonagall, and meant it. She would have bet almost anything against that working. Congratulations indeed, said Dumbledore. Even I did not make any original discoveries in Transfiguration before the age of 14. Not since the day of Dorothea Senjak has any genius flowered so early. "Thanks," Harry said, sounding a little surprised. "Nonetheless," Dumbledore said thoughtfully, "I think it would be most wise to keep this happy event a secret, at least for now." "Harry, did you discuss your idea with any other person before you spoke to Professor McGonagall?" There was silence.
Harry said.
"I don't want to turn anyone over to the Inquisition, but I did tell one other student, Dash." The word almost exploded from Professor McGonagall's lips.
"What?"
"You discussed a completely novel form of transfiguration with a student before consulting a recognized authority. Do you have any idea how irresponsible that was?"
"I'm sorry," said Harry.
"I didn't realize." The boy looked appropriately frightened, and Minerva felt something inside her relax. At least Harry understood how foolish he'd been. "You must swear Miss Granger to secrecy," Dumbledore said gravely. "And do not tell anyone else unless there is an extremely good reason for it, and they too have sworn."
Why?"
Harry said. Minerva was wondering the same thing. Once again, the headmaster was thinking too far ahead for her to keep up. "Because you can do something that no one else will believe you can do," Dumbledore said. "Something completely unexpected. It may prove to be your critical advantage, Harry, and we must preserve it. Please, trust me in this." Professor McGonagall nodded, her firm face showing nothing of her inner confusion. "Please do, Mr. Potter," she said. "All right," Harry said slowly. "Once we have finished examining your materials," Dumbledore added, "you may practice partial transfiguration, on glass to steel and steel to glass only, with Miss Granger to act as your spotter. Naturally, if either of you suspect any symptom of any form of transfiguration sickness, inform a professor at once." Just before Harry left the workroom, with his hand on the door handle, the boy turned back and said, "As long as we're here, have either of you noticed anything different about Professor Snape?" "Different," said the headmaster. Minerva didn't let her wry smile show on her face. Of course, the boy was apprehensive about the evil potions master, since he had no way of knowing why Severus was to be trusted. It would have been odd to say the least, explaining to Harry that Severus was still in love with his mother. "I mean, has his behavior changed recently in any way?" said Harry. "Not that I have seen," the headmaster said slowly. "Why do you ask?" Harry shook his head. "I don't want to prejudice your own observations by saying, just keep an eye out, maybe." That sent a quiver of unease through Minerva in a way that no outright accusation of Severus could have. Harry bowed to both of them respectfully and took his leave. "Albus," Minerva said after the boy had gone, "how did you know to take Harry seriously?"
"I
would have thought his idea merely impossible." The old wizard's face turned grave. "The same reason it must be kept secret, Minerva. The same reason I told you to come to me if Harry made any such claim. Because it is a power that Voldemort knows not." The words took a few seconds to sink in, and then the cold shiver went down her spine, as it always did when she remembered. It had started out as an ordinary job interview, Sybil Trelawney applying for the position of Professor of Divination. The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches. Born to those who have thrice defied him. Born as the 7th month dies. And the Dark Lord will mark him as his equal. But he will have power the Dark Lord knows not, and either must destroy all but a remnant of the other. For those two different spirits cannot exist in the same world. Those dreadful words, spoken in that terrible booming voice, didn't seem to fit something like partial transfiguration. "Perhaps not, then," Dumbledore said after Minerva tried to explain. "I confess I had been hoping for something that would help in finding Voldemort's Horcrux, wherever he may have hidden it. But..." The old wizard shrugged. "Prophecies are tricky things, Minerva, and it is best to take no chances. The smallest thing may prove decisive if it remains unexpected." "And what do you suppose he meant about Severus?" said Minerva. There I have no idea, sighed Dumbledore. Unless Harry is making a move against Severus, and thought that an open question might be taken seriously, where a direct allegation would be dismissed. And if that was indeed what happened, Harry correctly reasoned that I would not trust that it was so. Let us simply keep watch, without prejudice, as he asks. Aftermath 1. Hermione? Harry said in a very small voice. I think I owe you a really, really, really big apology. Aftermath 2. Alyssa Cornfoot's eyes were slightly glazed as she gazed upon the potion's master giving her class a stern lecture, holding up a tiny bronze bean and saying something about screaming puddles of human flesh. Ever since the start of this year, she'd been having trouble listening in potions. She kept staring at their awful, mean, greasy professor and fantasizing about special detentions. There was probably something really wrong with her, but she just couldn't seem to stop doing it. Ow, Alyssa said then. Snape had just flicked the bronze bean unerringly at Alyssa's forehead. Miss Cornfoot, said the potion's master, his voice cutting, this is a delicate potion, and if you cannot pay attention you will hurt your classmates, not just yourself. See me after class. The last 4 words didn't help her any, but she tried harder and managed to get through the day without melting anyone. After class, Alyssa approached the desk. Part of her wanted to stand there meekly with her face abashed and her hands clasped penitently behind her back, just in case, but some quiet instinct told her this might be a bad idea. So instead, she just stood there with her face neutral, in a posture that was very proper for a young lady, and said, Professor? Miss Cornfoot, Snape said without looking up from the sheets he was grading, I do not return your affections. I begin to find your stares disturbing, and you will restrain your eyes henceforth. Is that quite clear? Yes, said Alyssa in a strangled squeak, and Snape dismissed her, and she fled the classroom with her cheeks flaming like molten lava. 29. Egocentric bias. There'd been a sinking feeling in Hermione's stomach lately, every time she heard the other students talking about her and Harry. She'd been in a shower stall this morning when she'd overheard a conversation between Morag and Padma that had been the last straw piled on top of quite a lot of other straws. She was starting to think that getting involved in a rivalry with Harry Potter had been a terrible mistake. If she'd just stayed away from Harry Potter, she could have been Hermione Granger, the brightest academic star of Hogwarts, who was earning more points for Ravenclaw than anyone. She wouldn't have been as famous as the boy who lived, but she would have been famous for herself. Instead, the boy who lived had an academic rival, and her name happened to be Hermione Granger. And worse, she had gone on a date with him. The idea of getting into a romance with Harry had seemed like an appealing idea at first. She'd read books like that, and if there was anyone in Hogwarts who was a candidate for the heroine's love interest, it was obviously Harry Potter. Bright, funny, famous, sometimes scary. So she'd forced Harry into going on a date with her. And now she was his love interest. Or worse, one of the options on his dinner menu. She'd been in a shower stall that morning and just about to turn on the water when she'd heard giggles coming from outside. And she'd heard Morag talking about how that muggle-born girl probably wouldn't fight hard enough to win against Ginevra Weasley, and Padma speculating that Harry Potter might decide he wanted both. It was like they didn't understand that girls had options on their dinner menu and boys fought over them. But that wasn't even the part that hurt, really. It was that when she scored 98 on one of Professor McGonagall's tests, the news wasn't that Hermione Granger had scored the highest in the class. The news was that Harry Potter's rival had scored 7 more points than him. If you got too close to the boy who lived, you became part of his story. You didn't get your own. And the thought had come to Hermione that she should just walk away, but that would have been too sad. But she did want to get back what she'd accidentally given away by letting herself become known as Harry's rival. She wanted to be a separate person again instead of Harry Potter's third leg. Was that too much to ask?
It was a hard trap to climb out of once you fell in.
No matter how high you scored in class, even if you did something that deserved a special dinner time announcement, it just meant you were rivaling Harry Potter again. But she thought she'd come up with a way. Something to do that wouldn't be seen as pushing up on the opposite end of Harry Potter's seesaw. It would be hard. It would go against her nature. She would have to fight someone very evil, and she would need to ask someone even more evil for help. Hermione raised her hand to knock upon that terrible door. She hesitated. Hermione realized she was being silly and raised her hand a bit higher. She tried to knock again. Her hand quite failed to touch the door. And then the door swung open anyway. "Dear me," said the spider, sitting in its web. "Was it really that hard to lose a single Quirrell point, Miss Granger?" Hermione stood there with her hand raised, her cheeks growing pink. It had been. "Well, Miss Granger, I shall be merciful," said the evil Professor Quirrell. "Consider it already lost. There, I have taken a hard choice from you. Are you not grateful?" "Professor Quirrell," Hermione managed to say in a voice that squeaked a little. "I have a lot of Quirrell points, don't I?" "You do indeed," said Professor Quirrell. "Though one less than you had before. Terrible, isn't it? Just think, if I don't like your reason for coming here, you could lose another 50. Maybe I'd take them away one by one by one." Hermione's cheeks were going even redder. "You're really evil. Did anyone ever tell you that?" "Miss Granger," Professor Quirrell said gravely, "it can be dangerous to give people compliments like that when they have not been truly earned. The recipient might feel bashful and undeserving and want to do something worthy of your praise. Now, what was it you wanted to talk to me about, Miss Granger?" It was after lunch on Thursday afternoon, and Hermione and Harry were ensconced in a little library nook with the quietus field up so they could talk. Harry was lying stomach down on the ground with his elbows resting on the floor and his head in his hands and his feet kicking up casually behind him. Hermione was occupying a stuffed chair much too large for her, like she was the Hermione center of a candy shell. Harry had suggested that they could, as a first pass, read just the titles of all the books in the library, and then Hermione could read all the tables of contents. Hermione had thought this was a brilliant idea. She'd never done that with a library before. Unfortunately, there was a slight flaw in this plan. Namely, they were both Ravenclaws. Hermione was reading a book called Magical Mnemonics. Harry was reading a book called The Skeptical Wizard. Each had thought it was just one special exception they would make only this one time, and neither had yet realized it was impossible for either of them to ever finish reading all the book titles no matter how hard they tried. The quiet of their little nook was broken by 2 words. "Oh no," Harry suddenly said out loud, sounding like the words had been torn out of him. There was a bit more quiet. "He didn't," Harry said in the same voice. Then she heard Harry start giggling helplessly. Hermione looked up from her book. "All right," she said. "What is it?" "I just found out why you never ask the Weasleys about the family rat," Harry said. "It's really awful, and I shouldn't be laughing, and I'm a terrible person." "Yes," Hermione said primly, "you are." "Tell me too." "Okay, first the background. There's a whole chapter in this book about Sirius Black conspiracy theories. You remember who that is, right?" "Of course," said Hermione. Sirius Black was a traitor, a friend of James Potter who had let Voldemort into the protected home of the Potters. So it turns out there were a number of, shall we say, irregularities associated with Black going to Azkaban. He didn't get a trial, and the junior minister in charge when the Aurors arrested Black was none other than Cornelius Fudge, who became our current Minister of Magic. That sounded a little suspicious to Hermione too, and she said as much. Harry made a shrugging motion with his shoulders as he lay on the floor looking at his book. Suspicious things happen all the time, and if you're a conspiracy theorist, you can always find something. But no trial, said Hermione. It was right after the Dark Lord's defeat, Harry said, his voice serious as he said it. Things were incredibly chaotic, and when the Aurors tracked down Black, he was standing there laughing in a street ankle-deep in blood, with 20 eyewitnesses to recount how he'd killed a friend of my father's named Peter Pettigrew plus 12 bystanders. I'm not saying I approve of Black not getting a trial, but these are wizards we're talking about here, so it's not really any more suspicious than, I don't know, the sort of thing people point to when they want to argue over who shot John F. Kennedy. So anyway, Sirius Black is the wizarding Lee Harvey Oswald. There's all sorts of conspiracy theories about who really betrayed my parents instead of him, and one of the favorites is Peter Pettigrew, and this is where it starts getting complicated. Hermione listened, fascinated. But how do you go from there to the Weasleys' pet rat dash? Hold on, said Harry. I'm getting there. Now, after Pettigrew's death, it came out that he'd been a spy for the Light, not a double agent, just someone who snuck around and found things out. He'd been good at that since he was a teenager. Even in Hogwarts, he had a reputation for finding out all sorts of secrets. So the conspiracy theory is that Pettigrew became an unregistered animagus while he was still in Hogwarts, an animagus of something small that could scurry around and listen to conversations. The main problem being that successful animagi are rare, and doing it as a teenager would be really unlikely. So of course the conspiracy theory says that my father and Black were unregistered animagi too. And in that conspiracy theory, Pettigrew himself killed the 12 bystanders, turned into a small animagus form, and ran. So Michael Shermer says there are 4 additional problems with this. 1. Black was the only one besides my parents who knew how to get through the wards around their house. Harry's voice was a little hard as he said that. 2. Black was a more likely suspect to start with than Pettigrew. There's a rumor Black deliberately tried to get a student killed during his time at Hogwarts, and he was from this really nasty pureblood family. Bellatrix Black was literally his cousin. 3. Black was 20 times the fighting wizard that Pettigrew was, even if he wasn't as smart. The duel between them would have been like Professor Quirrell versus Professor Sprout. Pettigrew probably didn't even get a chance to draw his wand, let alone fake all the evidence the conspiracy theory requires. And 4. Black was standing in the street laughing. But the rat dash, said Hermione. Right, Harry said. Well, to make a long story short, Bill Weasley decided that his little brother Percy's pet rat was Pettigrew's animagus form dash. Hermione's jaw dropped. Yes, Harry said. You wouldn't exactly expect evil Pettigrew to be living a sad and furtive life as the pet rat of an enemy wizarding family. He'd either be with the Malfoys or, more likely, off in the Caribbean after a bit of plastic surgery. Anyway, Bill knocks out his little brother Percy, stuns and grabs the rat, sends out all these emergency owl messages dash. Oh no, Hermione said, the words torn out of her, and somehow manages to gather Dumbledore, the Minister of Magic, and the head Auror dash. He didn't, said Hermione. And of course when they get there they think he's crazy, but they use Veritas Oculum on the rat anyway, just to be sure, and what do they discover? She would have died. A rat. You and a cookie. So they dragged poor Bill Weasley off to St. Mungo's, and it turned out to be a pretty standard schizophrenic break. It just happens to some people, especially young men around what we'd consider college age. Guy was convinced he was 97 years old and had died and gone back in time to his younger self via a train station. And he responded perfectly well to antipsychotics and is back to normal and everything's fine now. Except people don't talk as much anymore about serious Black conspiracy theories, and you don't ever ask the Weasleys about the family rat. Hermione was giggling helplessly. It was really awful, and she shouldn't be laughing, and she was a terrible person. The thing I don't understand, Harry said, after their giggles had died down, is why Black would hunt down Pettigrew instead of running as fast as he could. He had to know the Aurors would be after him. I wonder if they got the reason out of Black before they took him to Azkaban? See, This is why people who are absolutely positively guilty still go through the legal system and get trials. Hermione had to agree with that. Soon Harry was done with his book while Hermione was only halfway through hers. Hers was a much more difficult book than Harry's, but she still felt embarrassed about that. And then she had to put magical mnemonics back on the shelf and drag herself away, because it was time for her to face the most dreaded class in Hogwarts, broomstick riding. Harry tagged along as she walked there, even though his own class wasn't until an hour and a half later, like a fighter jet escorting a sad little propeller plane on its way to its own funeral. The boy wished her goodbye in a quiet, sympathetic voice, and she walked onto the grassy fields of doom. And there was much shrieking and almost falling and horrible brushes with death, and the ground in completely the wrong place, and the sun getting in her eyes and Morag buzzing her, and Mandy thinking she was being subtle about always being near enough to catch her if she fell, and she knew the other students were laughing at both of them, but she never said anything to Mandy because she didn't actually want to die. After 10 million years, the class ended, and she was back on the ground where she belonged until next Thursday. Sometimes she had nightmares about it always being Thursday. Why everyone had to learn this, when they were just going to apparate or flow or portkey everywhere once they grew up, was a complete and utter mystery to Hermione. Nobody actually needed to ride broomsticks as an adult. It was like being forced to play dodgeball in PE. At least Harry had the decency to be ashamed of being good at it. It was a couple of hours later, and she was in a Hufflepuff study hall with Hannah, Susan, Leanne, and Megan. Professor Flitwick, surprisingly diffident for a teacher, had asked if she might possibly maybe help those four with their charms homework for a while, even though they weren't Ravenclaws, and Hermione had felt so proud she'd almost burst. Hermione took a piece of parchment, spilled a little bit of ink on it, tore it into 4 pieces, crumpled them, and tossed the pieces on the table. She could have gotten it just from crumpling it, but doing all that made it more like garbage, and that helped when someone was first practicing the disposal charm. Hermione sharpened her ears and eyes and said, "Okay, try it. Everto, 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 Everto." Hermione didn't think she'd quite caught all the problems. "Can you all try it again?" An hour later, Hermione had concluded that 1. Leanne and Megan were sort of sloppy, but if you asked them to keep practicing something, they would. 2. Hannah and Susan were focused and driven to the point where you had to keep telling them to slow down and relax and think about things instead of trying so hard. It was odd to think that those 2 would soon be hers. And 3. She liked helping Hufflepuffs. The whole study hall had a very cheerful atmosphere. When she left for dinner, she found the boy who lived reading a book while he waited to escort her. It made her feel flattered, and also a little worried because Harry didn't seem to really talk to anyone besides her. "Did you know there's a girl in Hufflepuff who's a metamorphmagus?" said Hermione as they headed toward the Great Hall. "She makes her hair really red, like stop sign red, not Weasley red, and when she spilled hot tea on herself, she turned into a black-haired boy until she got it under control again." "Really? Cool," said Harry, sounding a bit distracted. Hermione, just to check, you know tomorrow is the last day to sign up for Professor Quirrell's armies, right?" "Yes," Hermione said. "The armies of the evil Professor Quirrell." Her voice was a little angry, though Harry didn't know why, of course. "Hermione," Harry said, his voice exasperated, "he's not evil. He's a little bit dark and a whole lot Slytherin. It's not the same as being evil." Harry Potter had too many words for things. That was his problem. He would have been better off if he'd just divided the universe into good and bad. "Professor Quirrell called me up in front of the whole class and told me to shoot someone." "He was right," Harry said, his face sober. "I'm sorry, Hermione, but he was. You should have shot me, I wouldn't have minded. You can't learn battle magic if you can't practice against real opponents using real spells. And now you're doing okay in sparring, aren't you?" Hermione was only 12, and so she knew, but she couldn't put it into words. She couldn't find the thing to say that would convince Harry. Professor Quirrell had taken a young girl and called up that girl in front of everyone and ordered her to open fire, without provocation, on a classmate. It didn't matter if Professor Quirrell was right about her needing to learn it. Professor McGonagall wouldn't ever have done that. Professor Flitwick wouldn't ever have done that. Maybe not even Professor Snape would have done that. Professor Quirrell was evil. But she couldn't find the words, and she knew that Harry would never believe her. "Hermione, I've talked to older students," Harry said. "Professor Quirrell could be the only competent defense professor we get in all 7 years at Hogwarts. Anything else we can learn later. If we want to study defense, we have to do it this year. The students who sign up for the extracurricular stuff are going to be learning huge amounts, way beyond what the Ministry thinks first years are supposed to study. Did you know we're going to be learning the Patronus Charm? In January." "The Patronus Charm?" Hermione said, her voice going up in surprise. Her books said that was one of the brightest magics known, a weapon against the darkest creatures, cast with pure positive emotions. It wasn't something she'd expect the evil Professor Quirrell to teach, or arrange to be taught, since Hermione couldn't imagine he could do the spell himself. "Yes," Harry said. "Students don't usually learn the Patronus Charm until their 5th years, or even later. But Professor Quirrell says the Ministry schedules were made up by talking flobberworms, and the ability to cast the Patronus Charm depends on emotions more than magical strength. Professor Quirrell says that he thinks most students do way less than they can, and this year he's going to prove it." There was the usual tone of awed worship that Harry's voice had when he talked about Professor Quirrell, and Hermione gritted her teeth and kept walking. "I already signed up, actually," Hermione said, her voice a little quiet. "I did it this morning. For everything, just like you said. In for a penny, in for a pound was the usual expression. Besides, she didn't want to lose, and if she wanted to win, she had to learn. So, you will be in the armies, then?" Harry's voice was suddenly enthusiastic. "That's awesome, Hermione. I've already gotten my list of soldiers, but I'm sure Professor Quirrell will let me add one more. Or trade dash. I'm not joining your army." Hermione's voice was sharp. She knew it was a reasonable assumption, but it still annoyed her. Harry blinked. "Not Draco Malfoy's, surely. So you want to be in the 3rd Army? Even though we don't know who the general is yet." Harry sounded surprised and a little wounded, and she couldn't blame him, though of course she did blame him, since in fact it was all his fault. But why not mine? "Think about it," Hermione snapped, "and maybe you'll work it out." And she sped up her stride and left Harry gaping behind her. "Professor Quirrell," Draco said in his most formal voice, "I must protest your appointment of Hermione Granger as the 3rd General." "Oh," said Professor Quirrell, leaning back in his chair in a casual and relaxed manner. "Protest away, Mr. Malfoy. Granger is unfit for the position," said Draco. Professor Quirrell tapped a finger on his cheek thoughtfully. "Why, yes, she is. Do you have any further protests?" "Professor Quirrell," said Harry Potter beside him, "with all due respect to Miss Granger's many outstanding academic talents and the Quirrell points she has justly earned in your classes, her personality is not suited to military command." Draco had been relieved when Harry had agreed to accompany him to Professor Quirrell's office. It wasn't just that Harry was a gigantic blatant teacher's pet where Professor Quirrell was concerned. Draco had also started to worry that Harry actually was friends with Granger. It had been a while now, and he still hadn't made his move. But this was more like it. "I agree with Mr. Potter," said Draco. "Appointing her as a general turns it into a farce." "Harshly put," said Harry, "but I cannot bring myself to disagree with Mr. Malfoy. To be blunt, Professor Quirrell, Hermione Granger has around as much intent to kill as a bowl of wet grapes." "That," said Professor Quirrell mildly, "is not a thing I would fail to notice myself." "You are telling me nothing I do not already know." It was Draco's turn to say something, But the conversation had suddenly hiccuped. That answer had not been in the possibilities he and Harry had brainstormed before coming here. What did you say after the teacher said that he knew everything you knew, and he was still going to commit an obvious mistake? The silence stretched. Is this some sort of plot? Harry said slowly. Must everything I do be some sort of plot? Said Professor Quirrell. Can I ever create chaos just for the sake of chaos? Draco almost choked. Not in your battle magic class, Harry said with calm certainty. Other places, maybe, but not there. Professor Quirrell slowly raised his eyebrows. Harry gazed steadily back at him. Draco shivered. Well then, Professor Quirrell said, neither of you seem to have considered a very simple question. Who could I appoint instead of Miss Granger's? Blaise Zabini, Draco said without hesitation. Any other suggestions? Said Professor Quirrell, sounding quite amused. Anthony Goldstein and Ernie Macmillan, came the thought before Draco's common sense kicked in and ruled out mudbloods and Hufflepuffs no matter how aggressively they dueled. So instead Draco just said, What's wrong with Zabini? I see. Harry said slowly. I don't, said Draco. Why not Zabini? Professor Quirrell looked at Draco. Because Mr. Malfoy, no matter how hard he tries, he'll never be able to keep up with you or Mr. Potter. The shock of it staggered Draco. You can't believe Granger is going to dash. He's gambling on her, Harry said quietly. It's not guaranteed. The odds aren't even good. She'll probably never give us a good fight, and even if she does, it may take her months to learn. But she's the only one in our year with any chance at all of growing to beat us. Draco's hands twitched but didn't clench into fists. Showing up as your supporter and then backing out was a classic undermining tactic, so Harry Potter was in it with Granger, and that implied. But Professor, Harry went on smoothly, I'm worried Hermione will be miserable as the general of an army. I'm speaking as her friend now, Professor Quirrell. The competition might be good for Draco and me, but what you're asking her to do isn't good for her. Never mind. Your friendship for Hermione Granger does you credit, Professor Quirrell said dryly. Especially as you are able to be friends with Draco Malfoy at the same time. Quite a feat, that. Harry suddenly looked a little nervous, meaning he probably felt a lot more nervous, and Draco silently swore to himself. Of course, Harry wasn't going to fool Professor Quirrell. And I doubt Miss Granger would appreciate your friendly concern, said Professor Quirrell. She asked me for the position, Mr. Potter. I did not ask her. Harry was quiet at this for a moment. Then he flashed Draco a quick look that mixed apology and warning, saying at the same time, Sorry, I did my best, and we'd better not press it any further. As for her being miserable, Professor Quirrell went on, a slight smile now playing about his lips. I suspect that she will have a much easier time with the rigors of her position than either of you suspect, and that she will put up a good fight much sooner than you think. Harry and Draco both gasped in horror. You're not going to advise her, are you? Said Draco, utterly aghast. I never signed up to fight you, said Harry. The smile playing around Professor Quirrell's lips grew wider. As a matter of fact, I did offer to share a few suggestions regarding Miss Granger's first battles. Professor Quirrell, said Harry. Oh, don't worry, Professor Quirrell said. She turned me down. Just as I expected. Draco's eyes narrowed. Dear me, Mr. Potter, said Professor Quirrell. Didn't anyone ever tell you it's rude to stare? You're not going to secretly help her some other way, are you? Said Harry. Would I do that? Said Professor Quirrell. Yes, said Draco and Harry at the same time. I am wounded by your lack of trust. Well then, I promise not to help General Granger in any way that the two of you don't know about. And now I suggest that both of you be about your military affairs. November approaches, and swiftly, Draco saw the implications before the door had closed all the way behind them on their way out of Professor Quirrell's office. Harry had once spoken dismissively of people stuff, and now that was Draco's only hope. Let him not realize. We should just attack the Granger girl first and get her out of our way, said Draco. After we crush her, we can have our own contest without any distractions. Now that doesn't really seem fair to her, does it? Said Harry in a mild voice. What do you care? Said Draco. She's your rival, right? Then, with just the right note of suspicion in his voice, don't tell me you've started really liking her, after being her rival all this time. Founders forbid, said Harry. What can I say, Draco? I merely have a natural sense of justice. Granger does too, you know. She has a very firm grasp on good and evil, and she's probably going to attack evil first. Having a name like Malfoy is just asking for it, you know. Damn it. Harry, said Draco, sounding wounded and maybe a little superior. Don't you want to fight fairly against me? You mean rather than attacking you after you've already lost some of your forces beating Granger, said Harry. Oh, I don't know. Maybe after I get bored with just winning I'll try that fair thing. Maybe she'll attack you, Draco said. You're her rival. But I'm her friendly rival, Harry said with an evil grin. I bought her a nice birthday present and everything. You wouldn't go around sabotaging your friendly rival like that. What about sabotaging your friend's chance at a fair fight? Said Draco angrily. I thought we were friends. Let me rephrase that, said Harry. Granger wouldn't sabotage a friendly rival. But that's because she has the killing intention of a bowl of wet grapes. You would. You totally would. And guess what? So would I. Damn it. If it had been a play, there would have been dramatic music. The hero, impeccably turned out in green-trimmed robes and perfectly combed white blonde hair, faced the villain. The villain, leaning back in a simple wooden chair with her buck teeth clearly visible and stray chestnut curls drifting over her cheeks, faced the hero. It was Wednesday, October 30th, and the first battle was coming up on Sunday. Draco was standing in General Granger's office, a room the size of a small classroom. Why each general's office was so large, Draco wasn't quite sure. A chair and a desk would have worked for him. He wasn't even clear on why the generals needed offices at all. His soldiers knew where to find him. Unless Professor Quirrell had deliberately arranged the huge offices for them as a sign of status, in which case Draco was all for it. Granger sat on the room's single chair like a throne, all the way on the other end of the office from where the door opened. There was a long oblong table stretched across the middle of the room between them, and 4 small circular tables scattered around the corners, but only that one single chair, all the way at the opposite end. The room had windows along one wall, and one beam of sunlight touched the top of Granger's hair like a glowing crown. It would have been nice if Draco could have walked slowly forward. But there was a table in the way, and Draco had to go around it diagonally, and there was no good way to do that in a dramatic and dignified fashion. Had that been deliberate? If it had been his father, it surely would have been. But this was Granger, so surely not. There was nowhere for him to sit, and Granger hadn't stood up either. Draco kept the outrage entirely off his face. Well, Mr. Draco Malfoy, Granger said once he stood before her. You requested an audience with me, and I have been so gracious as to grant it. What was your plea? Come with me to visit Malfoy Manor, my father, and I would like to show you some interesting spells. Your rival, Potter, came to me with an offer, said Draco, putting a serious look on his face. He doesn't mind losing to me, but would be humiliated if you won. So, he wants to join with me and wipe you out immediately, not just in our first battle. All of them. If I won't do that, Potter wants me to hold back or harass you, while he launches an all-out attack on you as his first move. I see, Granger said, looking surprised. And you're offering to help me against him. Of course, said Draco smoothly. I didn't think what he wanted to do to you was fair. Why, "That's very nice of you, Mr. Malfoy," said Granger. "I'm sorry for how I spoke to you earlier. We should be friends. Can I call you Drakey?" Alarm bells started to sound in Draco's head, but there was a chance she meant it. "Of course," said Draco. "If I can call you Hermy." Draco was pretty sure he saw her expression flicker. "Anyway," Draco said, "I was thinking it would serve Potter right if we both attacked him and wiped him out. But that wouldn't be fair to Mr. Potter, would it?" said Granger. "I think it'd be very fair," Draco said. "He was planning to do it to you first." Granger was giving him a stern look that could possibly have intimidated him if he'd been a Hufflepuff instead of a Malfoy. "You think I'm pretty stupid, don't you, Mr. Malfoy?" Draco smiled charmingly. "No, Miss Granger, but I thought I'd at least check." "So, what do you want?" "Are you offering to bribe me?" said Granger. "Sure," said Draco. "Can I just slip you a galleon and have you beat on Potter instead of me for the rest of the year?" "Nope," said Granger, "but you can offer me 10 galleons and have me attack both of you equally, instead of just you." 10 galleons is a lot of money," Draco said cautiously. "I didn't know the Malfoys were poor," said Granger. Draco stared at Granger. He was starting to get a strange feeling about this. That particular reply didn't seem like it should have come from this particular girl. "Well," said Draco, "you don't get to be rich by wasting money, you know. I don't know if you know what a dentist is, Mr. Malfoy, but my parents are dentists and anything less than 10 galleons isn't worth my time at all." 3 galleons, Draco said, more as a probe than anything else. "Nope," said Granger. "If you want an equal fight at all, I don't believe that a Malfoy wants an equal fight less than he wants 10 galleons." Draco was starting to get a very strange feeling about this. "No," said Draco. "No," said Granger. "This is a limited time offer, Mr. Malfoy. Are you sure you want to risk a whole year of being miserably crushed by the boy who lived? That would be pretty embarrassing for the House of Malfoy, wouldn't it?" It was a very persuasive argument, one that was hard to refuse, but you didn't get to be rich by spending money when your heart told you it was a setup. "No," said Draco. "See you on Sunday," said Granger. Draco turned and walked out of the office without another word. That had been not right. "Hermione," Harry said patiently, "we're supposed to be plotting against each other. You could even betray me and it wouldn't mean anything outside the battlefield." Hermione shook her head. "It wouldn't be nice, Harry." Harry sighed. "I don't think you're getting into the spirit of this at all. It wouldn't be nice." She'd actually said that. Hermione didn't know whether to be insulted at what Harry thought of her, or worried about whether she really did sound like that much of a goody two-shoes usually. It was probably time to change the subject. "Anyway, are you doing anything special for tomorrow?" said Hermione. "It's Dash." Her voice cut off abruptly as she realized. "Yes, Hermione," Harry said a little tightly. "What day is it?" Interlude. There was a time when October 31st had been called Halloween in magical Britain. Now, it was Harry Potter Day. Harry had turned down all the offers, even the one from Minister Fudge, which might have been good for future political favors and which he really should have gritted his teeth and taken. But to Harry, October 31st would always be the Dark Lord killed my parents' day. There should have been a quiet, dignified memorial service somewhere, and if there was one, he hadn't been invited. Hogwarts got the day off to celebrate. Even the Slytherins didn't dare wear black outside their own dorm. There were special events and special foods, and the teachers looked the other way if anyone ran through the hallways. It was the 10th anniversary, after all. Harry spent the day in his trunk, so as not to spoil it for anyone else, eating snack bars in place of meals, reading some of his sadder science fiction books, no fantasy, and writing a letter to Mum and Dad that was much longer than the ones he usually sent. 30. Working in groups. Point 1. The day was Sunday, November 3rd, and soon the three great powers of their school year, Harry Potter, Draco Malfoy, and Hermione Granger, would begin their struggle for supreme dominance. Harry was slightly annoyed by the way the boy who lived had been demoted from supreme dominance to one of 3 equal rivals just by entering the contest, but he expected to get it back soon. The battleground was a section of non-forbidden forest, dense with trees, because Professor Quirrell thought that being able to see all the enemy forces was too boring even for your very first battle. All the students who were not actually in a first-year army were camped out nearby and watching on screens that Professor Quirrell had set up. Except for 3 Gryffindors in their 4th year, who were currently sick and confined to healers' beds by Madame Pomfrey. Aside from that, everyone was there. The students were dressed, not in their ordinary school robes, but in Muggle camouflage uniforms that Professor Quirrell had obtained somewhere and supplied in sufficient quantity and variety to fit everyone. It wasn't that students would have worried about stains and rips. That was what charms were for. But as Professor Quirrell had explained to the surprised Wizardborns, nice, dignified clothing was not efficient for hiding in forests or dodging around trees. And on each uniform's breast, a patch bearing the name and insignia of your army. A small patch. If you wanted your soldiers to wear, say, colored ribbons so that they could identify each other at a distance and risk the enemy getting their hands on the ribbons, that was all up to you. Harry had tried to get the name Dragon Army. Draco had pitched a fit and said that would confuse everyone completely. Professor Quirrell had ruled that Draco could lay prior claim to the name if he wished. So now Harry was fighting Dragon Army. This probably wasn't a good sign. For their insignia, instead of the 2 obvious dragons had breathing fire, Draco had elected to simply go with the fire. Elegant, understated, deadly. This is what's left after we've passed. Very Malfoy. Harry, after considering alternate choices such as the 501st Provisional Battalion and Harry's minions Obdoom, had decided that his army would be known by the simple and dignified appellation of the Chaos Legion. Their insignia was a hand poised with fingers ready to snap. It was universally agreed that this wasn't a good sign. Harry had earnestly advised Hermione that the young boys serving under her were probably nervous about her being a girl with a reputation for being nice, and that she should pick something scary that would reassure them of her toughness and make them proud to be part of her army, like the Blood Commandos or something. Hermione had named her army the Sunshine Regiment. Their insignia was a smiley face, and in 10 minutes, they would be at war. Harry stood in the bright forest clearing that was their assigned starting location, an area of open space with old and rotting tree stumps that had been cleared away for some unknown purpose, ground coated with a small scattering of blown leaves and the dried gray remnants of grass that had failed the test of summer's heat, and the sun shining down brilliantly from above. Around him were the 23 soldiers that Professor Quirrell had assigned to him. Nearly all of Gryffindor had signed up, of course, and more than half of Slytherin, and less than half of Hufflepuff, and a handful of Ravenclaw. In Harry's army, there were 12 Gryffindors and 6 Slytherins and 4 Hufflepuffs and 1 Ravenclaw besides himself. Not that there was any way to tell that by looking at the uniforms. No red, no green, no yellow, no blue. Just Muggle camouflage patterns, and a patch on the breast with the device of a hand poised to snap its fingers. Harry looked upon his 23 soldiers, all wearing the same uniforms with no marks of group identity save that single patch. And lo, Harry smiled, because he understood what this part of Professor Quirrell's master plan was about, and Harry was taking full advantage of it for his own purposes, too. There was a legendary episode in social psychology called the Robbers' Cave Experiment. It had been set up in the bewildered aftermath of World War II, with the intent of investigating the causes and remedies of conflicts between groups. The scientists had set up a summer camp for 22 boys from 22 different schools, selecting them to all be from stable middle-class families. The first phase of the experiment had been intended to investigate what it took to start a conflict between groups. The 22 boys had been divided into 2 groups of 11. And this had been quite sufficient. The hostility had started from the moment the two groups had become aware of each other's existences in the state park, insults being hurled on the first meeting. They'd named themselves the Eagles and the Rattlers. They hadn't needed names for themselves when they thought they were the only ones in the park, and had proceeded to develop contrasting group stereotypes, the Rattlers thinking of themselves as rough and tough and swearing heavily, the Eagles correspondingly deciding to think of themselves as upright and proper. The other part of the experiment had been testing how to resolve group conflicts. Bringing the boys together to watch fireworks hadn't worked at all. They just shouted at each other and stayed apart. What had worked was warning them that there might be vandals in the park, and the two groups needing to work together to solve a failure of the park's water system. A common task, a common enemy. Harry had a strong suspicion Professor Quirrell had understood this principle very well indeed when he had chosen to create 3 armies per year. 3 armies, not 4. And definitely not segregated by house, except that no Slytherins had been assigned to Draco besides Mr. Crabbe and Mr. Goyle. It was things like this which reassured Harry that Professor Quirrell, despite his affected dark atmosphere and his pretense of neutrality in the conflict between good and evil, was secretly backing good. Not that Harry would ever dare say that out loud. And Harry had decided to take full advantage of Professor Quirrell's plan to define a group identity his way. The Rattlers, once they'd met the Eagles, had started thinking of themselves as rough and tough, and they'd conducted themselves accordingly. The Eagles had thought of themselves as good and proper. And in that bright forest clearing, scattered around the old and rotting tree stumps, outlined in the sun shining down brilliantly from above, General Potter and his 23 soldiers were arranged in nothing remotely resembling a formation. Some soldiers stood, some soldiers sat, some stood on one leg just to be different. It was the Chaos Legion after all. And if there wasn't a reason to stand in neat little lines, Harry had said disdainfully, there weren't going to be neat little lines. Harry had divided the army into 6 squads of 4 soldiers each squad commanded by a squad suggester. All troops were under strict orders to disobey any orders they were given if it seemed like a good idea at the time, including that one, unless Harry or the squad suggester prefixed the order with Merlin says, in which case you were supposed to actually obey. The Chaos Legion's chief attack was to split up and run in from multiple directions, randomly changing vectors and firing the approved sleep spell as rapidly as you could rebuild the magical strength. And if you saw a chance to distract or confuse the enemy, you took it.
Fast.
Creative. Unpredictable. Non-homogeneous. Don't just obey orders. Think about whether what you're doing right now makes sense. Harry wasn't quite as sure as he'd pretended that this was the optimum of military efficiency, but he'd been given a golden opportunity to change how some students thought about themselves, and that was how he intended to use it. 5 minutes to wartime, according to Harry's watch. General Potter walked, not marched, over to where his Air Force was waiting tensely, broomsticks already clutched firmly in their hands. All wings report in, said General Potter. They'd rehearsed this during their one training session on Saturday. Red Leader standing by, said Seamus Finnegan, who had no idea what it meant. Red 5 standing by, said Dean Thomas, who'd waited his entire life to say it. Green Leader standing by, Theodore Knott said rather stiffly. Green 41 standing by, Tracy Davis said. I want you in the air the instant we hear the bell, said General Potter. Do not engage. Repeat, do not engage. Evade if under fire. Of course you did not aim sleep spells at broomsticks. You fired a spell that gave a temporary red glow to whatever it hit. If you hit the broomstick or the rider, they were out of the war. Red Leader and Red 5, fly toward Malfoy's army as fast as you can. Stay as high as you can while still seeing them. Return the instant you know for sure what they're doing. Green Leader, do the same for Granger's army. Green 41, fly above us and watch for any approaching broomsticks or soldiers. You, and only you, are authorized to fire. And remember, I didn't say Merlin says for any of that, but we do really need the information. For chaos. For chaos. The four echoed with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Harry expected Hermione to launch an immediate attack on Draco, in which case he'd move his troops into position and start supporting her, but only after she'd taken severe losses and caused some damage. He would frame it as a heroic rescue if possible. It wouldn't do to have Sunshine thinking that chaos wasn't their friend, after all. But just in case she didn't, well, that was why the Chaos Legion was staying put until Green Leader reported back. Draco's moves would be in his own self-interest. He would predictably ready his army to defend against Hermione. He might or might not realize that Harry had been lying about waiting to attack until after that battle finished. Harry had still put 2 broomsticks on Dragon Army, just in case they were doing something, and just in case Draco or Mr. Goyle or Mr. Crabbe was good enough to shoot a broomstick out of the sky. But General Granger was the unpredictable one, and Harry couldn't move until he knew how she was moving. In the heart of the forest, with shadow patterns dancing on the ground as leafy canopies swayed high above, General Malfoy stood where the trees were relatively sparser and looked out on his troops with calm satisfaction. 6 units of 3 troops each, the aerial unit of 4, to which Gregory was assigned, and the command unit, which was himself and Vincent. They'd only drilled for a short time on the previous Saturday, but Draco was confident that he'd managed to explain the basics. Stay with your mates, watch their back, and trust them to watch yours. Move as a single body. Obey orders and show no fear. Aim, fire, move, aim again, fire again. The 6 units were formed up in a defensive perimeter around Draco, watchfully gazing outward into the forest. Back to back they stood, wands gripped low until they needed to strike. They already looked remarkably like the Aura units whose training Draco had watched during his father's inspections. Chaos and Sunshine weren't going to know what hit them. "Attention," said General Malfoy. The 6 units unfolded and spun toward Draco. The faces of his broomstick riders turned from where they stood with broomsticks already in hand. Draco had decided to wait on demanding salutes until after they won their first battle, when Gryffindors and Hufflepuffs would be more willing to salute a Malfoy. But his soldiers were already standing straight enough, especially the Gryffindors, that Draco wondered if he'd even needed to delay. Gregory had quietly listened and reported back that Draco's volunteering to stand by Harry Potter in defense class, that time when Professor Quirrell had taught Harry how to lose, had marked Draco as an acceptable commander. At least if you happen to be assigned to his army. Not all Slytherins are alike. There are Slytherins, and then there are Slytherins was what the Gryffindors in Draco's army were quoting to their housemates. Draco was frankly astounded at how incredibly easy that had been. Draco had protested at first about not being assigned any Slytherins, and Professor Quirrell had told him that if he wanted to be the first Malfoy to gain complete political control of the country, he needed to learn how to govern the other 3/4 of the population. It was things like this which reassured Draco that Professor Quirrell had a great deal more sympathy for the good guys than Professor Quirrell was letting on. The actual battle wouldn't be easy, especially if Granger did attack the dragons first. Draco had agonized over whether to commit all his forces against Granger immediately in a preemptive strike, but had worried that, 1. Harry had been misleading him completely about what Granger was likely to do, and 2. Harry had been misleading him about waiting until after Granger's attack to join the battle. Though Dragon Army had a secret weapon, 3 of them in fact, which might be enough to win even if they were attacked by both armies at once. It was almost time, and that meant it was time for the pre-battle speech that Draco had composed and memorized. "The battle is about to begin," Draco said. His voice was calm and precise. "Remember everything that I and Mr. Crabbe and Mr. Goyle showed you. An army wins because it is disciplined and deadly. General Potter and the Chaos Legion will not be disciplined. Granger and the Sunshine Regiment will not be deadly. We are disciplined. We are deadly. We are dragons. The battle is about to begin, and we are about to win it. Extempore speech given by General Potter to the Chaos Legion immediately before their first battle on November 3rd, 1991 at 2:56 p.m. Smiley face. My troops, I'm not going to lie to you. Our situation today is very grim. Dragon Army has never lost a single battle, and Hermione Granger has a very good memory. The truth is, most of you are probably going to die, and the survivors will envy the dead. But we have to win this. We have to win this so that someday our children can enjoy the taste of chocolate again. Everything is at stake here. Literally everything. If we lose, the whole universe just blinks out like a light bulb. And now I realize that most of you don't know what a light bulb is. Well, take it from me, it's bad. But if we have to go down, let's go down fighting like heroes so that as the darkness closes in, we can think to ourselves, at least we had fun. Are you afraid to die? I know I am. I can feel those cold shivers of fear like someone is pumping ice cream into my shirt. But I know that history is watching us. It was watching us when we changed into our uniforms. It was probably taking pictures. And history, my troops, is written by the victors. If we win this, we can write our own history. A history in which Hogwarts was founded by 4 renegade house elves. We can make everyone study that history, even though it isn't true, and if they don't answer the right way on our tests, they'll fail the class. Isn't that worth dying for? No, don't answer that. Some things are better left unknown. None of us know why we're here. None of us know why we're fighting. We just woke up in these uniforms in this mysterious forest, knowing only that there was no way to get our names and memories back except victory. The students in those other armies out there, they're just like us. They don't want to die. They're fighting to protect each other, the only friends they have left. They're fighting because they know they have families who'll miss them, even if they can't remember now. They may even be fighting to save the world. But we have a better reason to fight than they do. We fight because we like it. We fight to amuse eldritch monstrosities from beyond space and time. We fight because we're chaos. Soon the final battle will begin. So let me say now, because I won't get a chance later, that it was an honor to be your commander, however briefly. Thank you. Thank you all. And remember, your goal isn't just to cut down the enemy, it's to make them afraid. A great booming gong echoed over the forest, and the Sunshine Regiment began to march. The tension rose and rose as Harry and the 19 other soldiers who remained waited for the aerial warriors to report back. It shouldn't take long. Broomsticks were fast, and the distances in the forest were not great. 2 broomsticks approached, at speed, from the direction of Draco's camp, and all the soldiers tensed. They weren't executing the maneuvers that were today's code for a friendly broomstick. Scatter and fire, roared General Potter, and then suited action to words, scurrying off at top speed toward the forest cover, and then as soon as Harry was among the trees, he spun back, raised his wand, tried to seek out the broomstick in the sky. Clear, shouted a voice. They're heading back. Harry gave a mental shrug. There'd been no way to prevent Draco from obtaining that information, and he'd only learned that they'd been standing still. And the chaotic slowly emerged from the forest. Broomstick approaching from Granger's direction, yelled another voice. I think it's Green Leader. He did the dip and roll. Moments later, Theodore not dived out of the sky and pulled up in the midst of the soldiers. Granger has divided her forces in 2, yelled Not as he hovered on his broomstick. There was sweat staining his uniform, and all the reserve was gone from his voice. She's attacking both armies. 2 brooms covering each force. They pursued me halfway here. Divided her army. What on earth? A large force concentrating fire on a small force could deplete that force rapidly without taking much damage in return. If 20 soldiers faced 10 soldiers, 20 sleep spells would be aimed at the 10 soldiers with only 10 sleep spells going the other way. So unless every one of those first sleep spells hit its target, the smaller force would lose more people than they could manage to take down with them. Defeated in detail was the military term for what happened when you divided your forces like that. What could Hermione possibly be thinking? Then Harry realized. She's being fair. It was going to be a long year in defense class. All right, Harry said loudly, so the army could hear. We'll wait until the Red Wing reports in, and then we'll go cloud up some sunshine. Draco listened to the flyer's reports with his face calm, all his shock concealed inside. What could Granger possibly be thinking? Then Draco realized. It's a feint. One of Sunshine's two forces would change direction, and both would converge on who? Neville Longbottom marched through the forest toward the approaching Sunny force, occasionally glancing up at the sky for broomsticks. Beside him marched his squad comrades, Melvin Coote and Lavender Brown of Gryffindor, and Alan Flint of Slytherin. Alan Flint was their squad suggester, though Harry had first said to Neville in private that the position was his if he wanted it. Harry had said quite a lot of things to Neville in private, starting with, Neville, if you want to become as awesome as the imaginary Neville who lives in your head but isn't allowed to do anything because you're scared, then you really should sign up for Professor Quirrell's armies. Neville was now sure the boy who lived could read minds. There was just no other way Harry Potter could have known. Neville had never talked about that with anyone or given any sign, and other people weren't like that. Not that Neville had ever noticed. And Harry's promise had come true. This did feel different from sparring in defense class. Neville had hoped that sparring would fix everything that was wrong with him, and, well, it hadn't. Even if he could fire a few spells at another student in class with Professor Quirrell watching to make sure nothing went wrong, even if he could dodge and fire back when it was allowed, and everyone else was expecting it, and they would stare at him funny if he didn't do it, none of that was the same as being able to stand up for himself. But being part of an army, something strange was stirring inside Neville as he marched through the forest alongside his comrades, upon their uniforms and insignia of fingers poised to snap. He was allowed to walk if he wanted to, but he just felt like marching. Beside him, Melvin and Lavender and Alan all seemed to feel like marching too. And Neville softly began to sing the Song of Chaos. The tune was what a Muggle would have identified as John Williams's Imperial March, also known as Darth Vader's theme. And the words Harry had added were easy to remember. Doom, doom, doom. Doom, 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 doom. Doom, doom, doom. Doom, 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 doom. Doom, doom, doom. Doom, 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 doom. Doom, 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 doom. Doom, doom, doom. Doom, doom, doom. By the second line, the others had joined in, and soon you could hear the same soft chant coming from nearby parts of the forest. And Neville marched alongside his fellow Chaos Legionnaires. Strange feelings stirring in his heart, imagination becoming reality, as from his lips poured a fearful song of doom. Harry stared at the bodies scattered across the forest. Something inside him felt a bit queasy, and he had to remind himself hard that they were only sleeping. There were girls among the fallen, and that made it a lot worse somehow, and he would have to be careful never to mention that in front of Hermione or the Aurors would find his remains stuffed into a small teapot. Half of Sunshine Army hadn't put up much of a fight against all of Chaos. The 9 ground soldiers had run in screaming inarticulately with simple shields raised, circular screens to protect their faces and chests. But you couldn't fire and hold the shield at the same time, and Harry's soldiers had simply aimed for the legs. All but one of the Sunnies had fallen over as soon as the cries of Somnium filled the air. That last one had dropped her shield and managed to take out one of Harry's soldiers before being hit by the second wave of sleep spells. The sleep hex was safe for multiple hits. The two Sunny broomsticks had been much harder to take down and had accounted for 3 chaotics before being auraed by massed ground fire. Hermione wasn't among the fallen. Draco must have gotten her, and that was making Harry feel angry on some completely incomprehensible level. He wasn't sure if he was feeling protective toward Hermione, or cheated that he hadn't been the one to do it, or maybe both. "All right," Harry said, raising his voice. "Let's everyone be clear on one thing. That wasn't a real fight. That was General Granger making a mistake in her first battle. Today's actual fight is with Dragon Army, and it's not going to be anything like this. It's going to be a lot more fun. Let's move out." A broomstick fell out of the sky, approaching terrifyingly fast, and spun on its end and decelerated so hard you could almost hear the air screaming in protest, and came to a halt directly beside Draco. It wasn't dangerous showing off. Gregory Goyle simply was that good, and he didn't waste time. "Potter's coming," Gregory said with no trace of his usual fake drawl. "They've still got all 4 of their brooms. You want me to take them out?" "No," Draco said sharply. "Fighting over their army gives them too much of an advantage. They'll fire on you from the ground, and even you might not be able to dodge at all. Wait until the forces engage." Draco had lost 4 dragons in exchange for 12 Sunnies. Apparently, General Granger actually had been that incredibly stupid, though she hadn't been among the attackers, so Draco hadn't gotten a chance to taunt her or ask her what in Merlin's name she had been thinking. The true battle, they all knew, would be with Harry Potter. "Prepare yourselves," roared Draco at his troops. "Stay together with your mates. Act as a unit. Fire as soon as the enemy is in range. Discipline against chaos. It shouldn't be much of a fight." The adrenaline was pumping and pumping into Neville's blood until he felt like he could hardly breathe. "We're closing in," said General Potter in a voice barely loud enough to carry to the whole army. "Time to spread out." Neville's comrades moved away from him. They would still support each other, but if you clustered together, the enemy would have a much easier time hitting you. Fire aimed at one of your comrades might miss and get you instead. You would be a lot harder to hit if you spread out and moved as fast as you could. The first thing General Potter had done during their training session was get them to fire on each other when both sides were running fast, or both stood still and took time to aim, or one was moving and one was standing still. The reverse charm to the sleep hex was simple, though you weren't allowed to use it during real battles. General Potter had carefully recorded everything that happened, done some figuring and ciphering, and then announced that it made more sense for them to focus, not on slowing down to aim carefully, but on moving fast so they wouldn't get hit. It still bothered Neville a little not to be marching side by side with his comrades, but the scary battle cries they'd learned were already thundering in his head, and that made up for a lot. This time, Neville silently vowed to himself. His voice was absolutely positively not going to squeak. "Shields up," said General Potter. "Power to forward deflectors." "Contigo," murmured the army, and the circular screens sprang into existence before their heads and chests. A sharp taste filled Neville's mouth. General Potter wouldn't have ordered them to cast shields unless they were almost in range. Neville could see the uniformed shapes of dragons moving through the dense screens of trees, and the dragons would be seeing them as well. "Attack!" came a cry from the distance. The voice of Draco Malfoy, and General Potter bellowed, "Charge dash!" All the adrenaline in Neville's blood was unleashed, and his legs took over, sending him flying faster than he'd ever run before, straight toward the enemy, knowing without needing to look that all his comrades were doing the same. "Blood for the blood god," screamed Neville. "Skulls for the skull throne." Shub-Niggurath. The enemy's gate is sideways. There was a soundless impact as a sleep spell wasted itself against Neville's shield. If there'd been other spells fired, they hadn't hit. Neville saw the brief look of fear on Wayne Hopkins's face as he stood beside two Gryffindors Neville didn't recognize. And then, Neville dropped the simple shield and fired at Wayne. Missed. His racing legs went straight past the enemy grouping and toward another 3 dragons, their wands coming up on him, their mouths opening. Not even thinking about it, Neville dived down to the forest floor just as 3 voices cried, "Somnium." It hurt, hard stones and hard twigs digging into Neville as he rolled. It wasn't as bad as falling off his broomstick, but he'd still hit the ground pretty hard. And then Neville, with sudden insight, lay still and closed his eyes. "Stop that," screamed a voice. "Don't shoot us, we're dragons." With a flash of glorious satisfaction, Neville realized that he'd managed to get between 2 groups of dragons, just as one group had fired on him. Harry had talked about this as a tactic for making the enemy afraid to fire, but apparently it worked a bit better than that. And not only that, the dragons believed they'd gotten him, since they'd seen Neville fall just as they fired. Neville counted to 20 inside his head, then opened his eyes a crack. The 3 dragons were very near him, heads spinning rapidly as cries of "Somnium" and "Skulls for the Skull Throne" filled the air around them. All 3 had simple shields up now. Neville's wand was still in his hand, and it didn't take much effort to point it at one boy's boots and whisper, "Somnium." Neville quickly closed his eyes and relaxed his hand as he heard the boy fall to the ground. "Where'd it come from?" screamed Justin Finch-Fletchley's voice, and Neville heard rustles on the leafy forest floor as of 2 dragons spinning around looking for an enemy. "Reform ranks," bellowed Malfoy's voice. "To me, everyone. Don't let them scatter you." Neville's ears heard the 2 dragons actually jump over his prone body as they ran off. Neville opened his eyes, pushed himself to his feet a bit painfully, and then pointed his wand and said the new charm that General Potter had taught them all. They couldn't do real illusion spells to confuse the enemy, but even at their age they could. "Ventriloquo," whispered Neville, pointing the wand to one side of Justin and the other boy, and then yelled, "For Cthulhu and glory." Justin and the other boy stopped abruptly, turning their shields toward where Neville had moved his battle cry, and that was when multiple cries of "Somnium" filled the air and the other boy dropped before Neville was finished aiming. "The last one's mine," yelled Neville, and then he started sprinting straight toward Justin, who'd been mean to him until the older Hufflepuffs straightened him out. Neville was surrounded by his comrades, and that meant special attack, chaotic leap, howled Neville as he ran, and felt his body lighten, then lighten twice again, as his comrades got their wands turned toward him and quietly cast the hover charm, and Neville raised his left hand and snapped his fingers, and then used his legs to push off the ground as hard as he could and soared through the air. Sheer shock painted Justin's face as Neville went over the other boy's shield and pointed his wand down at the form passing beneath him and cried, "Somnium." Because he'd felt like it, that was why. Neville didn't quite get his feet turned around properly and rather plowed into the ground as he landed, but 2 out of 3 of the other Chaos Legionnaires had managed to hold their wands on him throughout, and he didn't hit very hard. And Neville got to his feet, panting. He knew he should be moving. People were yelling "Somnium" all over the place. "I am Neville, the last scion of Longbottom," screamed Neville to the sky above, holding his wand pointed straight up as though to challenge the blazing blue heaven itself, knowing that nothing after this day would ever be the same again. "Neville of Chaos, face me if you did dash." When Neville woke up afterward, he was told that Dragon Army had taken this as their cue to counterattack. The girl beside Harry slumped to the ground, taking the shot meant for him, and he could hear Mr. Goyle's distant gloating laugh as his broomstick blasted past them, cutting the air so hard it should have shattered in his wake. "Luminos!" cried one of the boys next to Harry, who hadn't been able to rebuild the magical strength fast enough to do it earlier, and Mr. Goyle dodged it without a pause. Chaos had only 6 soldiers left now, and Dragon Army had 2, and the only problem was that one of those soldiers was invincible, and the other one was using up 3 soldiers just to cover him inside his shield. They'd lost more soldiers to Mr. Goyle than all the other dragons put together. He was weaving and dodging through the air so fast that no one could hit him, and he could shoot people while he did that. Harry had thought of all sorts of ways to stop Mr. Goyle, but none of them were safe. Even using the hover charm to slow him down. It was a continuous beam and much easier to aim. Wouldn't be safe because he might fall off the broomstick. Throwing things in his way wouldn't be safe, and that was getting harder and harder to remember as Harry's blood froze over. It's a game. You're not trying to kill him. Don't throw away all your future plans for a game. Harry could see the pattern. He could see how Mr. Goyle was weaving. He could see how and when they all needed to fire in order to create a web of shots that Mr. Goyle wouldn't be able to dodge, but he just hadn't been able to explain it fast enough to soldiers. They couldn't coordinate their shots well enough, and now they didn't have enough people left to do it. I refuse to lose. Not like this. Not my whole army to one soldier. Mr. Goyle's broomstick turned faster than anything should have been able to turn and started to angle in toward Harry and his surviving troops. He could sense the boy beside him tensing, getting ready to throw himself in front of his general. Screw this. Harry's wand came up, focusing on Mr. Goyle. Harry's mind visualized the pattern, and Harry's lips opened and his voice screamed. Luminos, 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 luminosal luminos, 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 luminos dash. When Harry's eyes opened again, he found himself resting in a comfortable position with his hands folded over his chest, holding his wand like a fallen hero. Slowly, Harry sat up. His magic was aching, a strange sensation but not an entirely unpleasant one. Much like the burn and lethargy that followed hard physical exercise. The general's awake, cried a voice, and Harry blinked and focused in that direction. 4 of his soldiers held their wands on a shimmering prismatic hemisphere, and Harry realized that the battle wasn't over. Right? He hadn't been hit by a sleep hex, just exhausted himself, so when he woke up, he was still in the game. Harry suspected he was going to get a lecture from someone or other about not exhausting his magic to the point of unconsciousness over a children's game. But he hadn't hurt Mr. Goyle when he'd lost his temper, and that was the important thing. Then Harry's mind clicked on another implication, and he looked down at the steel ring on his left hand's pinky finger and almost swore out loud when he saw that the tiny diamond was missing and there was a marshmallow lying on the ground near where he'd fallen. He'd sustained that transfiguration for 17 days, and would now need to start over. Could have been worse. He could have done this 14 days later, after Professor McGonagall had approved him to transfigure his father's rock. That was one very good lesson to learn the easy way. Note to self: always remove ring from finger before completely exhausting magic. Harry pushed himself up, making rather hard going of it. Using up your magic didn't exhaust your muscles, but dodging around trees certainly did. He staggered over to the iridescent hemisphere that contained Draco Malfoy, who was holding his wand aloft to sustain the shield, and smiling coldly at Harry. "Where's the 5th soldier?" said Harry. Said a boy whose name Harry couldn't remember at the moment. "I fired a sleep hex at the shield, and it bounced off and hit Lavender. I mean, the angle shouldn't have been right, but it did." Draco was smirking inside the shield. "So let me guess," Harry said, looking Draco directly in the eyes. "Those neat little trios are the formation used by professional magical militaries? Made up of trained soldiers who can easily hit moving targets if their own hands are steady, and who can combine their defensive powers so long as they stay together. Unlike your soldiers?" The smirk had vanished from Draco's face, which was now hard and grim. "You know," Harry said lightly, knowing that none of the others would understand the real message passing between them. "It just goes to show that you should always question everything you see your role models doing, and ask why it's being done, and whether it makes sense in context for you to do it too. Don't forget to apply that advice to real life, by the way. And thanks for the slow-moving cluster targets. Because Draco had already gotten that lecture, and Harry suspected, discounted it out of suspicion that Harry was trying to shift his loyalties further away from pure-blood tradition. Which of course Harry was. But this example would make an excellent excuse, next Saturday, to claim that questioning authority was a merely practical technique for real life. And Harry would also mention the experiments he'd run, first with individuals and then with groups, to check that his ideas about the importance of speed had actually been correct, by way of hammering home the point of Draco needing to keep an eye out at all times for chances to apply the methods in everyday practice. "You haven't won yet, General Potter," snarled Draco. "Maybe we'll run out of time, and Professor Quirrell will call it a draw." A fair and worrisome point. The war only ended when Professor Quirrell, in his personal judgment, decided one army had won by practical real-world standards. There was no formal victory condition, Professor Quirrell had explained, because then Harry would figure out how to game the rules. Harry had to admit this was a fair cop. And Harry couldn't blame Professor Quirrell for not calling an end, because it was plausible that the last soldier of Dragon Army could take out all 5 survivors of the Chaos Legion. "All right," Harry said. "Does anyone know anything about General Malfoy's shield spell?" It developed that Draco's shield was a version of the standard Protego, which had several disadvantages, the most important of which was that the shield couldn't move with a caster. The upside, or from Harry's perspective, downside, was that it was easier to learn, easier to cast, and much easier to sustain for long times. They would need to hammer the shield with attack spells in order to bring it down. And Draco could apparently exert some control over the angle of reflection at which the spells would bounce off. The thought occurred to Harry that they could use Wingardium Leviosa to pile up heavy rocks on the shield until Draco couldn't sustain it against the pressure. But then the rocks might fall in afterward and hit Draco, and injuring the enemy general for real was not among today's goals. "So," said Harry, "are there such things as specialized shield-piercing spells?" There were. Harry asked if any of his soldiers knew them. No one did. Draco was smirking again, inside his shield. Harry asked if there was any sort of attack spell that wouldn't bounce. Lightning bolts, it seemed, were usually absorbed by shields instead of bouncing off them. No one knew how to cast any sort of lightning-related spell. Draco sniggered. Harry sighed. He quite deliberately laid his wand on the ground, and Harry announced, with some weariness in his voice, that he would just go ahead and take down the shield himself, using some method that would remain mysterious, and everyone else was to fire on Draco as soon as his shield went down. The Chaos Legionnaires looked nervous. Draco looked calm, which was to say, controlled. A thin, folded blanket came out of Harry's pouch. Harry sat down next to the shimmering shield and pulled the blanket over his head so no one could see what he did, except Draco, of course. From Harry's pouch came a car battery and a set of jumper cables. It wasn't like he'd been about to leave the Muggle world to start a new era of magical research and not take along any way of generating electricity. Shortly after, the Chaos Legionnaires heard the sound of fingers snapping, followed by a crackling noise from beneath the blanket. The shield started glowing more brightly, and Harry's voice said, "Don't be distracted, please. Eyes on General Malfoy." The strain was showing on Draco's face, along with the fury and annoyance and frustration. Harry smiled up at him and mouthed, "Tell you later." And that was when a spiral of green energy shot out of the forest and smashed into Draco's shield, which shrieked like pieces of sharp glass being rubbed together, and Draco staggered. In sudden, frantic panic, Harry took the jumper cables off the battery and fed them into the pouch. Then he fed the battery itself into the pouch, and then he tore off the blanket and grabbed his wand and stood up. All of his soldiers were still there and glancing around frantically. "Contigo," Harry said, and his soldiers followed suit, but Harry didn't even know which direction the shield ought to be pointing in. Did anyone see where that came from? Shaken heads. And General Malfoy, would you mind telling me if you got General Granger? Why, yes, Draco said acidly. I mind.
Oh, hell.
Harry's mind began calculating. Draco inside the shield. Draco worn out now to some degree. Harry worn out too. Hermione in the woods who knew where. Harry and 4 other chaotics left. You know, General Granger, Harry said out loud, you really should have waited to attack until after I'd fought General Malfoy. You might have been able to get all the survivors. From somewhere came a girl's high-pitched laughter. Harry froze. That wasn't Hermione. And that was when the dreadful, eerie, cheerful chant began to rise, coming from all around them. Don't be frightened. Don't be sad. We'll only hurt you if you're bad. Granger cheated, burst out Draco inside the shield. She woke up her soldiers. Why doesn't Professor Quirrell dash? Let me guess, Harry said, the sickness already churning in his stomach. He really hated losing. It was a very easy battle, right? They dropped like flies. Yes, Draco said. We got them all on the first shot dash. The look of horrified realization spread from Draco to the Chaos Legionnaires. No, Harry said, we didn't. Camouflaged forms were appearing from among the trees. Allies,
Harry said.
Allies, Draco said. Good, said General Granger's voice, and a spiral of green energy blazed out of the woods and shattered Draco's shield to splinters. General Granger surveyed the battlefield with a definite feeling of satisfaction. She was down to 9 Sunshine soldiers, but that was probably enough to handle the last survivor of the enemy forces, especially when Parvati and Anthony and Ernie were already holding their wands on General Potter, whom she'd ordered taken alive. Well, conscious. It was bad, she knew, but she'd really wanted to gloat. There's a trick, isn't there? Said Harry, this strange showing in his voice. There has to be some trick. You can't just turn into a perfect general. Not on top of everything else. You're not that Slytherin. You don't write creepy poetry. No one's that good at everything. General Granger glanced around at her Sunshine soldiers and then looked back at Harry. Everyone was probably watching this on the screens outside. And General Granger said, I can do anything if I study hard enough. Oh, now that's just for you, Dash. Somnium. Harry slumped to the ground in mid-sentence. Sunshine wins, intoned the huge voice of Professor Quirrell, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. Niceness has triumphed, cried General Granger. Hooray, shouted the Sunshine soldiers. Even the Gryffindor boys said it, and they said it with pride. And what's the moral of today's battle? Said General Granger. We can do anything if we study hard enough. And the survivors of the Sunshine Regiment marched off toward the victory field, singing their marching song as they went. Don't be frightened, don't be sad. We'll only hurt you if you're bad, and send you to a home that's true. With new friends to watch over you, be sure to tell them you were sent by Granger's Sunshine Regiment. Thank you for joining us for Part 6, Chapters 26 to 30 of Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality. This tale continues to captivate us with its ingenious blend of logic and magic, turning every chapter into an intellectual adventure. Did you know? Les Wrong's Methods of Rationality was initially inspired by the author's passion for cognitive science and effective altruism, themes that subtly weave their way into Harry's character. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Grimoire Audiobooks. Let us know your favorite moment from this part and how Harry's logical approach resonates with you. As we venture further into this reimagined magical world, let Harry's curiosity remind us all that the quest for knowledge is a journey worth taking. Until next time, stay curious, stay magical, and we'll see you for the next chapter of this unforgettable story.